Welcome to this journey through some of humanity's most profound philosophical dilemmas. I'm glad you've joined me for these hours of contemplation. As we explore these fascinating questions together, allow your mind to wander through the intellectual landscapes we'll visit, free from the constraints of needing immediate answers. These philosophical dilemmas have captivated the greatest minds throughout history. Tonight, we're not seeking definitive solutions, rather, we're embracing the questions themselves. There's something deeply calming about confronting life's greatest mysteries, acknowledging our limitations, and finding peace in the exploration itself. The act of philosophical contemplation can be profoundly relaxing. As we engage with these ideas, you may find your everyday concerns fading into the background. The mind naturally seeks patterns and understanding, and there's a certain relief in redirecting that energy toward abstract concepts rather than personal worries. Consider this an invitation to intellectual wandering. Some concepts may resonate with you, others might challenge your assumptions, and many will simply give you something fascinating to consider as you drift toward sleep. There are no wrong reactions here, only the natural flow of thought. In this first hour, we'll explore questions of existence, what it means to be, to know, and to perceive. These foundational questions form the bedrock of philosophical inquiry. They ask us to examine not just the world around us, but the very nature of our experience of that world. So make yourself comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin our journey through the philosophical dilemmas that have shaped human thought for millennia. Leave a comment sharing which philosophical concept resonated most deeply with you or what questions arose during your listening session. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to receive notifications about future episodes where we will continue to unravel the deepest mysteries of human existence, morality, and meaning. Your participation will enrich this community of curious minds. And if you know someone who enjoys philosophical contemplation or who could benefit from these moments of deep reflection, please share this video with them. Together, we can create a space where life's big questions are explored calmly and deeply. The self and identity. The ship of Theseus. One of the oldest philosophical puzzles comes to us from ancient Greece, the paradox of the ship of Theseus. Imagine a wooden ship that has been kept in a harbor as a museum piece for hundreds of years. Over time, as parts of the ship begin to decay, they are replaced with new, identical pieces. Plank by plank, nail by nail, the ship is gradually restored. After several decades of this careful preservation, every single component of the original ship has been replaced. The question arises, is it still the same ship? This might seem like a simple question of semantics, but it cuts to the heart of how we understand identity over time. If we say it's the same ship, we're suggesting that identity is somehow tied to form or function rather than material composition. The ship maintains the same design, serves the same purpose, occupies the same space in the harbor, but contains none of its original matter. Now imagine a further complication. Suppose someone had collected all the discarded original parts of the ship as they were replaced. And over the years, this person carefully restored each original piece and reassembled them into a second ship, identical in design to the first. Which vessel, if either, is the true ship of Theseus? Some philosophers argue that the continuity of form is what matters. The ship that remained in the harbor, gradually being replaced piece by piece without ever ceasing to be a ship, maintains its identity throughout the process. Others contend that material composition is essential. The reassembled ship, made of the original materials, has the stronger claim to being the authentic ship of Theseus. But perhaps the deeper insight is that our concept of identity itself might be flawed. We naturally want to say that something either is or isn't the same object over time, but the ship of Theseus suggests that identity might exist on a spectrum rather than as a binary property. This ancient paradox takes on new relevance in our modern world. Consider your smartphone or computer after several repairs and component replacements. Is it still the same device? Or think about the human body, which replaces most of its cells every few years. Are you physically the same person you were a decade ago? As you contemplate the ship of Theseus, consider how this paradox might apply to your own sense of identity. What aspects of yourself remain constant as your body changes, your beliefs evolve, and your memories fade or transform? In what sense are you the same person who existed years ago, and in what sense have you become someone new? Split-brain consciousness. From thought experiments, let's turn to a real phenomenon that raises profound questions about the unity of consciousness and personal identity: split-brain patients. In the mid-20th century, surgeons developed a procedure to treat severe epilepsy by cutting the corpus callosum bundle of nerve fibers, connecting the left and right hemispheres of the brain. This procedure, known as a corpus callosotomy, was effective at preventing seizures from spreading between the hemispheres, but it led to some unexpected and philosophically fascinating results. Researchers discovered that in these split-brain patients, the two hemispheres could function independently, sometimes even exhibiting different desires, perceptions, and intentions. In controlled experiments, information presented only to the right visual field processed by the left hemisphere, which typically controls language, could be verbally described by the patient. However, information presented only to the left visual field processed by the right hemisphere could not be verbally described, though the patient could use their left hand to identify related objects. In one famous experiment, different images were shown to each hemisphere. When asked to draw what they saw with their left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, the patient drew one image. When asked to verbally describe what they saw, a function of the left hemisphere, they described an entirely different image. Each hemisphere was unaware of what the other had perceived. This raises profound questions. Is a split-brain patient one person or two? If consciousness can be divided in this way, what does that tell us about the nature of the unified self that most of us experience? Some philosophers argue that these cases reveal that consciousness and selfhood are not the indivisible entities we intuitively believe them to be. Rather, our sense of being a unified self might be a construction and narrative the brain creates to make sense of its own processes. When the physical structure enabling this unified narrative is severed, we can observe the constructedness of consciousness itself. Others maintain that despite the apparent division, split-brain patients remain a single person with a divided processing system. They point to the fact that outside laboratory settings, these patients generally function as unified individuals with consistent goals and self-identity. The disconnection becomes apparent only under specific, experimental conditions. The split-brain phenomenon challenges our intuition that consciousness must be unified and indivisible. It suggests that what we experience as a single, continuous self might be more fragmented and modular than we realize. Perhaps our sense of being a singular, unified I is itself a kind of useful illusiona, simplification of the complex, distributed processes occurring across our brains. As you reflect on this real-world example of divided consciousness, consider your own experience of selfhood. Have you ever felt internal conflicts that seemed almost like different parts of yourself pulling in opposite directions? Have you ever acted in ways that later seemed alien or incomprehensible to you? The split-brain cases might suggest that these experiences are not metaphorical but reflect genuine multiplicity within our neural architecture. Personal identity through time. Having explored physical and psychological aspects of identity, let's now consider how identity persists and changes through time. What makes you the same person today as you were 10 years ago? What about when you were a child? Will you be the same person decades from now? Philosophers have proposed several theories to explain personal identity over time. The physical continuity view suggests that bodily continuity is what matters. You are the same person as long as your physical body persists through a continuous path through space and time. This view is intuitive, but faces challenges from cases like teleportation or gradual replacement scenarios like the ship of Theseus. The psychological continuity view, championed by philosophers like John Locke, argues that memory and psychological connections are what matter. You are the same person as your past self if you can remember being that person, and if there's a chain of psychological connections linking your current mental states to past ones. This view better accommodates the fact that our bodies change while our sense of self persists, but it raises questions about people with memory disorders or radical psychological changes. A third approach, the narrative view, suggests that personal identity consists in the story we tell about ourselves. We create cohesion and meaning by constructing autobiographical narratives that connect our past, present, and anticipated future. On this view, the self is not discovered but created through ongoing self-interpretation. Each of these theories captures something important about identity, but each also faces significant challenges. Perhaps identity through time is not an all-or-nothing property but exists on a spectrum. You might be more or less the same person as your past self depending on how much physical, psychological, and narrative continuity exists between you. Consider how these philosophical perspectives might apply to your own life. Think about yourself 10 years ago. In what ways are you the same person? In what ways have you become someone else? If you encountered your past self, would you recognize them as you? Or would they seem like a distinct individual who simply shares some of your memories and characteristics? And what about the future? The person you will be decades from now may have different values, beliefs, memories, and physical characteristics. To what extent should you consider their interests when making decisions today? Are you morally responsible for actions that this future self might take, shaped by decisions you make now? As we age, our cells are replaced, our beliefs evolve, our memories fade, and our values shift. Yet somehow, through all these changes, most of us maintain a sense of being the same person. This persistent sense of selfhood, despite constant change, remains one of the deepest mysteries of human experience. Brain in a vat. Let's now turn our attention from questions about the self to questions about the reality we perceive. How do we know that the world as we experience it corresponds to what actually exists? Consider this scenario, proposed by philosophers like Hilary Putnam, as a modern version of Descartes' skeptical challenges. Imagine that a team of scientists has removed your brain from your body and placed it in a vat of nutrients that keeps it alive. The scientists have connected your brain to a supercomputer that feeds you electrical impulses identical to those you would receive if you were walking around in the physical world. From your perspective, everything seems normal. You appear to have a body, you interact with other people, you feel sensations like hunger and pain, you see colors and shapes and movement. The crucial point is this: if you were actually a brain in a vat, you would have no way of knowing it. Every piece of evidence you could gather, sensation, perception, or scientific experiment would be generated by the computer program and fed directly into your neural pathways. Even your thought, "Am I a brain in a vat?" would itself be part of the simulation. This thought experiment raises a fundamental epistemological question. How can we know that what we perceive as reality isn't an elaborate illusion? The brain in a vat scenario suggests that we cannot definitively rule out radical skeptical hypotheses about the nature of our experience. Our sensory evidence cannot distinguish between genuine perception of an external world and a perfectly simulated facsimile of that perception. Some philosophers, like Putnam himself, have argued that the brain in a vat scenario is self-refuting. They suggest that if you were a brain in a vat, when you use the term brain or vat, you wouldn't actually be referring to real brains and vats, which you've never encountered, but to the simulated entities in your virtual world. Thus, the statement, "I am a brain in a vat," would be false if uttered by a brain in a vat. Other philosophers maintain that the scenario presents a genuine challenge to our claims to knowledge. Even if we cannot meaningfully assert that we are brains in vats, the possibility that we lack access to reality as it actually is remains troubling. The brain in a vat scenario has taken on new relevance in our technological age. As virtual reality becomes increasingly sophisticated, distinctions between real and simulated experiences begin to blur. Some philosophers and scientists have even suggested that we might already be living in a computer simulation created by a more advanced civilization, a modern twist on the brain in a vat hypothesis. As you reflect on this thought experiment, consider the foundations of your own knowledge. How much of what you believe is based ultimately on sensory experience? If that experience could be simulated, what certainties remain? Does the inability to rule out skeptical scenarios like the brain in a vat undermine your confidence in what you know, or do you find such extreme skepticism unproductive? Perhaps most importantly, if you cannot definitively know whether your experience corresponds to an external reality, does that change how you should live or what you should value? A dim glimpse of what is real. True knowledge comes not through the senses, but through philosophical reasoning that grasps the eternal, unchanging forms behind the shifting world of appearance. On another level, the allegory speaks to the transformative but potentially alienating nature of education and enlightenment. Once we see beyond conventional understandings, we can never return to our former limited perspective. Yet this new vision may separate us from others who haven't shared our journey. In a modern context, we might interpret the cave as a metaphor for various limitations on our understanding: cultural biases, technological mediation of experience, cognitive shortcomings, or even neurological constraints on what we can perceive. Like the cave prisoners, we might mistake our limited perspective for the totality of reality. As you contemplate Plato's cave, consider what shadows you might be mistaking for reality in your own life. What unexamined assumptions or limitations might be constraining your understanding? Have you ever had an experience that fundamentally transformed how you see the world, making your previous perspective seem limited or illusory? And if you achieved a more complete understanding of reality, would you, like Plato's freed prisoner, feel compelled to return to the cave to share your insight with others? What challenges might you face in communicating a perspective that transcends conventional understanding? Gettier problems. For much of philosophical history, knowledge was defined as justified true belief. For you to know something, 3 conditions had to be met. 1, you had to believe it. 2, it had to be true. And 3, you had to have good justification for believing it. This definition seemed intuitively correct and withstood scrutiny for centuries until 1963, when an American philosopher named Edmund Gettier published a 3-page paper that revolutionized epistemology, the philosophical study of knowledge. Gettier presented several counterexamples showing situations where someone could have a justified true belief that nonetheless does not seem to qualify as knowledge. These Gettier cases revealed that the traditional definition was missing something important. Here's a classic Gettier case. Imagine that Smith has strong evidence that Jones owns a Ford. Smith also knows that Brown is in Barcelona, though he has no idea where Brown is at the moment. Based on his justified belief about Jones, Smith forms the belief either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Barcelona. This disjunctive belief is justified because Smith has good evidence for the first part, and it is true because Brown is in fact in Barcelona. But here's the twist. Jones actually does not own a Ford. Smith's evidence was misleading. So Smith has a justified true belief, but it seems wrong to say he knows that either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Barcelona. His belief is true only by luck, for reasons unrelated to his justification. Gettier cases reveal that knowledge requires more than justified true belief. But what exactly is this additional element? Philosophers have proposed various solutions. One approach suggests that knowledge requires that your belief be caused in the right way by the fact that makes it true. In the example above, Smith's belief isn't caused by the fact that Brown is in Barcelona. Another approach argues that knowledge requires ruling out relevant alternative possibilities. Smith hasn't ruled out the possibility that Jones doesn't own a Ford. A third approach suggests that knowledge requires that your justification be undefeated, that there isn't additional evidence you could acquire that would undermine your current justification. In the example, learning that Jones doesn't own a Ford would defeat Smith's justification. The Gettier problem might seem abstract, but it touches on a fundamental question: what makes knowledge different from a lucky guess or an accidentally true belief? In everyday life, we distinguish between someone who knows something and someone who merely believes something that happens to be true. The challenge is articulating exactly what this distinction consists in. As you reflect on the Gettier problem, consider instances in your own experience where you or someone else had a justified true belief that you wouldn't classify as knowledge. Perhaps you made a prediction that turned out to be correct, but for reasons entirely different from those you based it on. Or maybe you trusted information from a source that was generally reliable, but happened to be mistaken in this particular case, yet you ended up with a true belief anyway through some coincidence. The Gettier problem reminds us that knowledge involves a connection to truth that goes beyond mere coincidence or Luca connection that proves surprisingly difficult to precisely define. The problem of induction. You are. Final exploration in this section concerns a challenge that strikes at the heart of scientific knowledge and everyday reasoning about the future. The problem of induction. Inductive reasoning involves drawing general conclusions from specific observations. When you expect the sun to rise tomorrow because it has risen every day in your experience, you're reasoning inductively. When scientists test a hypothesis through repeated experiments and then formulate a general law, they're using induction. Much of our knowledge about the world, from the mundane prediction that your coffee will wake you up tomorrow as it did today, to sophisticated scientific theories about subatomic particles, relies on this form of reasoning. But in the 18th century, philosopher David Hume identified a fundamental problem. Inductive reasoning itself cannot be justified without circular logic. Any attempt to justify induction by pointing to its past reliability, induction has worked before, so it will work in the future, is itself an inductive argument. It assumes the very principle it's trying to prove, that past patterns will continue into the future. Hume argued that there is no logical necessity connecting past events to future ones. The fact that the sun has risen every day in human memory does not logically entail that it will rise tomorrow. We expect this pattern to continue based on habit and psychological custom, not because we can deduce it from first principles or observe the future directly. This creates a profound philosophical puzzle. If induction cannot be justified without circularity, how can we claim that scientific knowledge which relies heavily on inductive reasoning is rationally superior to superstition or random guessing? Why should we expect patterns observed in the past to continue into the future? Philosophers have proposed various responses to Hume's challenge. Some argue that while induction cannot be justified in the sense of being proven valid through deductive logic, it can be shown to be reliable in other ways. For instance, perhaps natural selection has shaped our cognitive tendencies to match the actual regularities in the world, making inductive reasoning generally reliable even if we cannot prove it must be so. Others suggest that we should think of induction in terms of probability rather than certainty. While past patterns don't guarantee future ones, they may make certain future events more probable than others, allowing for rational prediction without claiming certainty. Still others, following philosopher Karl Popper, argue that science doesn't actually rely on induction at all, but rather on a process of conjecture and refutation. Scientists propose bold hypotheses and then attempt to falsify them through testing. On this view, scientific theories are never verified by evidence. They are merely not yet falsified, remaining perpetually open to revision or rejection. The problem of induction reminds us of the provisional nature of much of our knowledge. When we make predictions about the future based on past experience, whether in science, personal planning, or everyday life, we are making an assumption that the future will resemble the past in relevant ways. This assumption has served us well in practice, but it cannot be justified through pure logic alone. As you contemplate the problem of induction, consider how it affects your confidence in various beliefs. Does the lack of a non-circular justification for induction undermine your trust in scientific knowledge? Or do you find that the practical success of inductive reasoning provides sufficient warrant for continuing to rely on it, even if we cannot provide the kind of justification that would satisfy a strict logician? Perhaps most importantly, the problem of induction reminds us that even our most well-established knowledge about the world contains an element of faith, not religious faith, but a fundamental trust that the patterns we've observed will continue to hold in contexts we haven't yet experienced. The problem of other minds. While the hard problem asks why consciousness exists at all, the problem of other minds poses a different question. How do we know that other beings are conscious like we are? I know directly, through first-person experience, that I am conscious. I have immediate access to my own thoughts, feelings, and sensations. But I can never directly experience anyone else's consciousness. I see your behavior, hear your words, observe your expressions, but your subjective experience itself remains forever private and inaccessible to me. This creates a fundamental asymmetry in how we know about consciousness. My knowledge of my own mind is direct and non-inferential, while my knowledge of other minds must always be indirect and based on inference from observable behavior. The problem of other minds asks, what justifies my belief that other humans, or animals, or potentially artificial intelligences, have subjective experiences similar to my own? How do I know you're not a philosophical zombia, being that behaves exactly like a conscious person but lacks any internal subjective experience? One traditional approach to this problem is the argument from analogy. I observe that other humans have physical bodies similar to mine, with similar neural structures. They behave in ways that, in my own case, are associated with conscious experiences. When you wince and withdraw your hand from a hot surface, it resembles what I do when I feel pain. Therefore, I infer by analogy that you are also having a subjective experience of pain. Critics of this approach note that inference by analogy seems too weak to support our confident everyday attributions of consciousness to others. The sample size, just my own case, is remarkably small for making such a sweeping generalization about all other humans. An alternative approach suggests that our understanding of other minds is more fundamental than inference. Perhaps we directly perceive certain aspects of others' mental states in their expressions and behavior, without needing to infer them through analogy. When I see your smile, I don't first observe physical movements of facial muscles and then infer happiness. I directly perceive the happiness in the smile itself. The problem extends beyond just knowing whether others are conscious at all. Even if we grant that other humans have conscious experiences, how can we know what those experiences are like? This question becomes particularly acute when we consider experiences that differ significantly from person to person. Consider the experience of synesthesia, where stimulation of one sensory pathway leads to experiences in another, such as seeing sounds as colors. If you don't have synesthesia, can you truly understand what it's like to have that experience? Or consider more common variations. Do you and I experience the color red in the same way? When we both look at a sunset and call it beautiful, are we having comparable subjective experiences? Thomas Nagel famously explored this question in his essay, "What is it like to be a bat?" He argued that even if we knew everything about bat physiology and behavior, we still couldn't know what it's subjectively like to be a batto navigate by echolocation, to hang upside down, to have a bat's desires and perceptions. The first-person perspective of another being remains, in principle, inaccessible to us. This inaccessibility creates a profound form of epistemic isolation. Each conscious being inhabits a subjective world that others can never fully enter. Yet paradoxically, we also feel deeply connected to others through empathy, communication, and shared experiences. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein suggested that our shared language and forms of life allow us to bridge this gap, at least partially. The problem becomes even more complex when we consider non-human animals. Without shared language, how can we know about their subjective states? We can observe that many animals have neural structures similar to those associated with consciousness in humans, and that they exhibit behaviors suggesting pain, pleasure, fear, and other experiences. But the precise nature and extent of animal consciousness remains an open question with significant ethical implications for how we treat other species. The emergence of sophisticated artificial intelligence adds yet another dimension to the problem. As AI systems become more complex, they may begin to exhibit behaviors that would suggest consciousness if we observe them in humans or animals. How could we determine whether such systems actually have subjective experiences or are merely simulating the outward signs of consciousness? Some propose behavioral or functional tests. If a system acts conscious in all observable ways, perhaps we should treat it as conscious. Others argue that without understanding how consciousness arises from physical processes in human brains, we cannot know whether different physical systems might give rise to consciousness in other ways. The problem of other minds takes on new dimensions when we consider non-human animals or artificial intelligences. What evidence would justify attributing consciousness to an AI system? Is behavioral similarity to humans sufficient? Or do we need to understand the underlying mechanisms? If an AI system claimed to be conscious, should we take its word for it? As you contemplate this problem, consider how it affects your everyday interactions with others. Despite the philosophical puzzle, most of us live as if the consciousnesses of those around us were an unquestionable fact. We naturally respond to others' expressions of joy, pain, confusion, or understanding as if their subjective experiences were as real as our own. Perhaps this natural certainty about other minds reveals something important about our social nature as humans. The problem of other minds reminds us that every conscious being is, in a sense, a universe of experience inaccessible to others. Your subjective world and mine may resemble each other in important ways, but they remain separated by a gap that neither science nor philosophy has fully bridged. This mystery lies at the heart of what it means to be an individual consciousness in a world of other conscious beings. Descartes' evil demon. Let's continue our exploration of skeptical challenges by examining one of the most radical doubts ever proposed in philosophy, René Descartes' hypothesis of an evil demon. In his Meditations on First Philosophy, published in 1641, Descartes embarked on a project to find absolutely certain knowledge by systematically doubting everything that could possibly be doubted. He questioned the reliability of his senses, noting that they sometimes deceive him. He considered that he might be dreaming rather than awake, since dreams can seem real while we're experiencing them. But then Descartes pushed skepticism to its extreme limit by proposing what we might call the ultimate conspiracy theory. What if an all-powerful, malicious demon was dedicated to deceiving him about everything? This demon could be creating all of his sensory experiences, implanting false memories, and even making him believe in the laws of mathematics and logic when these are not actually true. Unlike the brain in a vat scenario, which assumes that the laws of nature and logic still apply within the simulation, Descartes' evil demon hypothesis questions even these fundamentals. Perhaps 2 + 2 = 4 seems self-evidently true only because the demon makes it appear so to your mind. This totalizing doubt led Descartes to his famous insight, cogito, ergo sum, or I think therefore I am. Even if an evil demon were deceiving him about everything else, Descartes reasoned that he could not be deceived about his own existence as a thinking being. For even to be deceived, he must exist as something that can be deceived. The very act of doubting proves the existence of the doubter. From this single certainty, his existence as a thinking thing, Descartes attempted to rebuild knowledge on secure foundations, eventually arguing for the existence of a benevolent God who would not permit the kind of systematic deception the evil demon hypothesis proposed. Modern philosophers have generally been skeptical of Descartes' reconstruction of knowledge from the cogito. But the evil demon thought experiment remains powerful as an illustration of how far skeptical doubt can extend and how difficult it is to find absolutely certain knowledge. Descartes' methodological doubt was revolutionary in its approach. Rather than beginning with what we believe we know and then addressing skeptical challenges, he started from a position of radical doubt and sought to build knowledge from whatever could withstand this doubt. This method of systematic skepticism has remained influential in philosophy, encouraging us to question our most basic assumptions. The demon hypothesis raises profound questions about the relationship between thought and reality. If an evil demon could manipulate even our mathematical and logical reasoning, what does this tell us about the nature of these forms of knowledge? Are mathematical truths discovered in some external reality? Or are they constructions of human minds? Does logic describe necessary features of reality, or just constraints on human thinking? Descartes' approach also highlights the special status of self-knowledge. While we might be mistaken about the external world, it seems impossible to be mistaken about the fact that we are thinking, whatever the content of those thoughts might be. This asymmetry between knowledge of the self and knowledge of the world continues to fascinate philosophers of mind and epistemology. Critics of Descartes have questioned whether the cogito really provides the secure foundation he sought. Some note that the inference from thinking is occurring to I exist as a thinking thing presupposes the very kind of logical reasoning that the evil demon hypothesis calls into question. Others suggest that the certainty of the cogito may be psychological rather than logical. We cannot help but believe in our own existence, but this doesn't prove that such belief is immune to theoretical doubt. The evil demon hypothesis finds modern echoes in skeptical scenarios like the brain in a vat or the simulation hypothesis. Each of these updates Descartes' concern with new technology, but the fundamental philosophical challenge remains the same. How can we know anything about reality when our only access to it comes through faculties that might be systematically deceived? Interestingly, Descartes' response to skepticism ultimately relied on theological assumptions that many modern philosophers would not share. Without his arguments for God's existence and benevolence, the reconstruction of knowledge from the cogito remains incomplete. This highlights how difficult the problem of radical skepticism truly is. Centuries after Descartes, philosophers continue to debate how or whether it can be overcome. The evil demon hypothesis raises questions about what kinds of knowledge, if any, are immune to skeptical doubt. Is Descartes right that we can be certain of our own existence as thinking beings? What about logical and mathematical truths? Can we, through pure reason alone, establish any knowledge about reality that stands independent of sensory experience? As you reflect on Descartes' thought experiment, consider what you take to be your most certain knowledge. What beliefs do you hold that seem immune to doubt? Would they withstand the kind of radical skepticism Descartes proposed? And if not, does that undermine their practical value or importance in your life? Perhaps most importantly, consider whether absolute certainty is necessary for knowledge in the ordinary sense. Might we accept that our beliefs are fallible without abandoning the notion that we know many things about ourselves and the world? The search for certainty that motivated Descartes continues to shape how we think about knowledge, evidence, and the limits of human understanding. These challenges connect to long-standing debates in moral philosophy between consequentialist approaches that focus on producing the best outcomes and deontological or virtue-based approaches that emphasize rights, duties, character, and the intrinsic value of persons. They remind us that our moral intuitions are complex and pluralistic, drawing on multiple values that sometimes come into tension with each other. As you reflect on these thought experiments, consider what they reveal about your own moral values. Is maximizing overall well-being always the right goal? What other values might constrain or complement the pursuit of the greatest happiness for the greatest number? And how might we balance these different moral considerations when they conflict? The original position and reflective equilibrium. Let's expand our understanding of Rawls's approach to justice by exploring two key methodological concepts: the original position and reflective equilibrium. The original position, which includes the veil of ignorance we discussed earlier, is a hypothetical situation designed to model fairness and impartiality in choosing principles of justice. Rawls argues that the principles chosen in this situation would be fair because they're selected under conditions that eliminate biases and self-interest. But why should we accept the original position as the appropriate starting point for thinking about justice? Rawls's answer involves the idea of reflective equilibrium, a method for developing and refining our moral judgments through a process of mutual adjustment between particular judgments and general principles. We begin with our considered moral judgments, those made under favorable conditions, without distorting influences like fear or self-interest. These might include judgments like slavery is wrong or people shouldn't be discriminated against based on their race. We then seek principles that would explain and systematize these judgments. When our principles conflict with our judgments, we have options. We can revise the principles to better fit our judgments, or we can reconsider our judgments in light of the principles. Over time, through this back-and-forth process, we work toward reflective equilibrium, a state where our moral judgments and principles mutually support each other in a coherent whole. Rawls argues that the original position and the principles it yields are justified because they achieve reflective equilibrium with our considered judgments about justice. The original position isn't arbitrary. It's designed to model ideas about fairness and impartiality that we already accept. And if the principles derived from it seem counterintuitive, that may lead us to reconsider either those principles or our initial judgments. This approach recognizes that moral reasoning isn't simply deductive, starting from self-evident principles and deriving conclusions, or inductive, generalizing from particular cases. Instead, it's a complex process of adjusting both our principles and our judgments to achieve greater coherence and clarity. The method of reflective equilibrium has been applied beyond questions of justice to many areas of moral philosophy. It offers a middle path between moral frameworks that give ultimate authority to abstract principles and those that emphasize particular judgments or intuitions. It acknowledges both the importance of principled consistency and the significance of our moral reactions to specific cases. Critics of reflective equilibrium question whether achieving coherence among our moral beliefs guarantees their truth or justification. Coherent moral systems might still be built on flawed foundations. Others worry that the method gives too much weight to conventional moral intuitions, which may be biased by culture, history, or psychology. Despite these concerns, reflective equilibrium remains a powerful tool for ethical inquiry, way of testing and refining our moral views by seeking balance between principles and judgments, theory and practice, abstraction and particularity. As you consider Rawls's approach to justice, reflect on your own process of moral reasoning. How do you balance general principles with specific judgments? When they conflict, which do you typically revise? And how might the ideal of reflective equilibrium seeking coherence among all your moral beliefs guide your thinking about difficult ethical questions? Free will and determinism. Laplace's demon. Let's now explore a thought experiment that has profound implications for how we understand causation, determinism, and freedom. Laplace's demon. In the early 19th century, the French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace proposed a striking image to illustrate his view of physical determinism. He imagined an intelligence, later known as Laplace's demon, that knows the precise location and momentum of every particle in the universe at a given moment, along with all the forces acting upon them and the laws governing their movements. With this perfect knowledge and sufficient computational power, the demon could predict with absolute certainty the entire future history of the universe, as well as retrospect its entire past. As Laplace put it, we may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. An intellect which at a certain moment would know all forces that set nature in motion, and all positions of all items of which nature is composed, if this intellect were also vast enough to submit these data to analysis, it would embrace in a single formula the movements of the greatest bodies of the universe and those of the tiniest atom. For such an intellect, nothing would be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes. This thought experiment presents a powerful vision of causal determinism, the view that every event is necessitated by prior events and the laws of nature. In a deterministic universe, given identical initial conditions, the same outcome will always occur. There's only one possible future consistent with the current state of the universe and the laws governing it. Laplace's demon challenges our intuitive sense of freedom and possibility. If the demon could predict with perfect accuracy every decision you will ever make, every word you'll speak, every action you'll take in, what sense are those decisions really yours? If the future is already fixed by the present, and ultimately by the distant past, before you were born, how can your choices be free? This thought experiment gains additional force from the success of Newtonian physics, which seemed to describe a perfectly deterministic universe governed by precise mathematical laws. In principle, with sufficient information and computational power, we could predict everything from the motion of planets to the fall of an apple. However, developments in physics since Laplace's time have complicated this picture. Quantum mechanics, with its probabilistic nature and phenomena, like the uncertainty principle, suggests that perfect prediction might be impossible even in principle. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics introduce genuine indeterminism into the physical world. Moreover, chaos theory reveals that even in deterministic systems, tiny differences in initial conditions can lead to vastly different outcomes, the butterfly effect. This means that practical prediction of complex systems is severely limited, even if theoretical determinism holds. But many philosophers argue that physical indeterminism alone doesn't solve the philosophical problem. Random or probabilistic causation doesn't necessarily give us the kind of freedom that seems meaningful for moral responsibility. We typically want our choices to be determined by our reasons, values, and character, not by random quantum fluctuations. This has led to compatibilist accounts of free will, which argue that freedom is compatible with determinism because it doesn't require the ability to have done otherwise in exactly the same circumstances. Instead, freedom might involve acting according to your own desires and values, without external constraint, even if those desires and values are themselves determined by prior causes. Others maintain an incompatibilist position, arguing that genuine freedom requires some form of agent causation, the ability of a person to initiate causal chains that aren't fully determined by prior events. As you reflect on Laplace's demon, consider what kind of freedom matters to you. Does the possibility of perfect prediction undermine your sense of choice and agency? Or can you reconcile determinism with a meaningful conception of freedom? What implications might this have for moral responsibility, praise and blame, reward and punishment? The thought experiment reminds us that our everyday experiences of deliberation, choice, and possibility exist within a world governed by causal processes we still don't fully understand. The relationship between physical causation and human agency remains one of philosophy's most profound and enduring puzzles. Frankfurt cases. From Laplace's determinism, let's turn to a thought experiment specifically designed to challenge a common assumption about free will and moral responsibility. Harry Frankfurt's famous counterexamples, now known as Frankfurt cases. Traditionally, many philosophers had assumed that moral responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise, that a person is responsible for an action only if they could have chosen a different action. This principle, sometimes called the principle of alternate possibilities, PAP, seemed intuitively plausible. How could someone be blamed for an action if they couldn't have done anything else? Frankfurt's insight was to construct scenarios where this principle seems to fail, cases where a person appears morally responsible for an action even though they couldn't have done otherwise. Here's a classic Frankfurt case. Imagine that Jones is deciding whether to shoot Smith. Unknown to Jones, a neuroscientist named Black has implanted a device in Jones's brain that monitors his neural activity. If Jones shows any sign of deciding not to shoot Smith, the device will activate, taking control of Jones's brain and forcing him to shoot Smith anyway. However, as it happens, Jones decides on his own to shoot Smith and does so. Black's device remains inactive. In this scenario, Jones couldn't have done otherwise had he decided not to shoot Smith. Black's device would have activated and forced him to do so anyway. But intuitively, many people feel that Jones is still morally responsible for shooting Smith, since he did so of his own volition, for his own reasons, without any intervention from Black. Frankfurt cases suggest that what matters for moral responsibility isn't the ability to do otherwise, but rather the actual process by which a decision is made. Jones is responsible because his action flowed from his own decision-making process, not from external manipulation, even though that manipulation would have occurred had he decided differently. This insight has profound implications for debates about free will and determinism. If Frankfurt is right that moral responsibility doesn't require the ability to do otherwise, then determinism, the view that every event is necessitated by prior events and laws, might not threaten moral responsibility in the way many had assumed. Even in a deterministic universe where no one could ever have done otherwise, people might still be responsible for actions that flow from their own decision-making processes. Critics of Frankfurt's argument have proposed various responses. Some argue that while Jones couldn't have done otherwise in terms of the final action, shooting Smith, he could have done otherwise in terms of forming the initial decision before Black's device would activate. Others suggest that Frankfurt cases still involve a weakened form of alternative possibilities, the ability to at least begin to decide otherwise, even if that decision would be overridden. The debate about Frankfurt cases continues, but they have permanently altered how philosophers think about freedom and responsibility. They've shifted attention from abstract metaphysical questions about determinism and indeterminism to more nuanced psychological questions about the relationship between an agent's values, reasoning, decisions, and actions. As you reflect on Frankfurt cases, consider what implications they might have for how we understand moral responsibility in everyday life. If what matters isn't whether someone could have done otherwise, but rather the relationship between their values, reasoning, and actions, how might this change how we think about praise and blame, reward and punishment? And what might this tell us about the kind of freedom that truly matters to us as human beings? Compatibilism versus incompatibilism. Having explored determinism and moral responsibility through specific thought experiments, let's now directly address one of philosophy's most enduring debates. Is free will compatible with determinism? Determinism, as we've seen, is the view that every event, including human actions, is necessitated by prior events and the laws of nature. Given the initial conditions of the universe and the laws governing it, everything that happens could not have happened otherwise. The question of whether free will is compatible with determinism divides philosophers into three main camps. Incompatibilist determinists, sometimes called hard determinists, argue that determinism is true and incompatible with free will. Since our actions are determined by prior causes beyond our control, they maintain that we lack free will in the sense required for moral responsibility. This view is associated with philosophers like Baron d'Holbach and Paul Ray. Incompatibilist libertarians, not to be confused with the political position, agree that determinism is incompatible with free will, but they reject determinism, arguing that at least some human actions are not completely determined by prior causes. Libertarians typically propose some form of agent causation, where persons can initiate new causal chains not fully determined by prior events. This view is associated with philosophers like Roderick Chisholm and Robert Caine. Compatibilists argue that free will is compatible with determinism. They maintain that the kind of freedom required for moral responsibility doesn't involve the ability to have done otherwise in exactly the same circumstances, but rather involves acting according to one's own desires, values, and reasoning, without external constraint or coercion. This view is associated with philosophers like David Hume, John Stuart Mill, and Harry Frankfurt. The debate hinges partly on how we understand the concept of free will. Incompatibilists often argue that genuine freedom requires the ability to have done otherwise in exactly the same circumstances, a condition that determinism seems to rule out. Compatibilists, on the other hand, argue that this conception of freedom is incoherent or irrelevant to what we truly value about freedom. Consider a compatibilist analysis of what it means to act freely. When you make a decision that aligns with your deeply held values and desires, without being coerced or manipulated. You're exercising your freedom even if, given your specific values, desires, and the circumstances, you couldn't have chosen differently. What matters is not that you could have done otherwise in the exact same situation, but that your action flowed from your own authentic decision-making process. Imagine someone who saves a child from drowning at risk to themselves. A compatibilist would say this person acted freely if they acted from their own values and character, without coercion. Even if given who they are, they couldn't have done otherwise in that situation. The action expressed their character and values, and that's what makes it free and praiseworthy. Incompatibilists might respond that if determinism is true, then our values, desires, and character are themselves determined by factors beyond our control or genetics, upbringing, and experiences. How can we be responsible for actions that flow from a character we didn't ultimately choose? Compatibilists might counter that this sets an impossible standard for responsibility. What matters is not the ultimate origin of our character, which would lead to an infinite regress, but the relationship between our current self or values, desires, and reasoning and our actions. This debate connects to how we think about moral responsibility, blame and praise, and the significance of choice in human life. It also relates to practical questions about criminal justice, rehabilitation, and how we respond to harmful behavior. As you consider these positions, reflect on what conception of freedom matters most to you. Does the kind of freedom that's worth wanting require the ability to have done otherwise in exactly the same circumstances? Or is it enough that your actions flow from your own authentic values and reasoning? How do your intuitions about specific cases of moral responsibility align with your theoretical position on free will and determinism? The free will debate reminds us that our most fundamental concepts, freedom, responsibility, choice, contain complexities and tensions that philosophical analysis can help us explore, even if it can't provide simple, definitive answers. The consequence argument. Let's examine a powerful argument against compatibilism known as the consequence argument, developed by philosopher Peter van Inwagen. The consequence argument aims to show that if determinism is true, then no one has control over their actions in the sense required for free will. It proceeds by highlighting how determinism connects our actions to conditions in the distant past and laws of nature that we cannot control. Here's a simplified version of the argument. If determinism is true, then our present actions are the necessary consequences of the past and the laws of nature. We have no control over the past before our birth. We have no control over the laws of nature. We have no control over the necessary consequences of things over which we have no control. Therefore, if determinism is true, we have no control over our present actions. The argument relies on what van Inwagen calls a transfer of powerlessness principle. If we have no power over X, and no power over the fact that X leads to Y, then we have no power over Y. Consider an example. If the laws of physics and the state of the universe a billion years ago entail that you will choose coffee over tea tomorrow, and you have no control over either the laws of physics or events a billion years ago, how could you have control over your choice of beverage? The consequence argument presents a significant challenge to compatibilism. It suggests that the kind of control compatibilists identify with free will control that's compatible with determinism isn't robust enough to ground moral responsibility. If our actions are the inevitable results of conditions we didn't create or control, how can we be truly responsible for them? Compatibilists have developed several responses to this argument. Some challenge the transfer of powerlessness principle, arguing that it doesn't apply to cases where the connection between past conditions and present actions flows through an agent's own deliberation and values. While I can't change the past or the laws, I can still meaningfully control my actions when they express my authentic self. Others distinguish between different kinds of control or ability. When compatibilists say we could have done otherwise, they mean we would have done otherwise if we had chosen differently, not that we could have done otherwise given the exact same past and laws. This conditional analysis of ability is compatible with determinism. Still, others embrace a revised understanding of moral responsibility that doesn't require the kind of ultimate control the consequence argument suggests we lack. Even if our actions are determined by factors we didn't create, we can still be accountable for them as expressions of our character and values. The debate over the consequence argument connects to deeper questions about what makes someone the author of their actions. Does authorship require that the action wasn't determined by prior causes? Or can we meaningfully author actions that flow from our character and reasoning, even if that character and reasoning were shaped by factors beyond our control? As you reflect on the consequence argument, consider how it applies to specific actions in your own life. When you make a choice, to what extent is that choice influenced by your past experiences, your temperament, your values, and external circumstances? Does recognizing these influences undermine your sense of control and responsibility, or can you reconcile the reality of causal influence with a meaningful conception of agency and authorship? The consequence argument reminds us that traditional concepts of free will and responsibility contain tensions and complications that philosophical analysis can help us navigate, even if it can't provide simple resolutions. Moral luck. Let's conclude our exploration of free will and responsibility by examining a related puzzle: the problem of moral luck. Moral luck occurs when factors beyond an agent's control significantly affect how much praise or blame they deserve. The concept, developed by philosophers Thomas Nagel and Bernard Williams, challenges the intuitive principle that people should only be morally judged for things within their control. Consider 4 kinds of moral luck. Resultant luck. When the actual outcomes of an action, which may depend on factors beyond the agent's control, affect moral judgment. 2 equally reckless drivers might face very different moral judgments if one happens to hit a pedestrian while the other doesn't. Circumstantial luck. When the circumstances one faces, which may be beyond one's control, affect moral judgment. Someone born in Nazi Germany might face moral tests that someone born elsewhere wouldn't, and we judge people differently based on how they respond to such tests. Constitutive luck. When one's character, dispositions, and capacities, which may be largely determined by genetics and early environment, affect moral judgment. We praise or blame people for traits they may not have chosen or created. Causal luck. When everything that determines who one is and what one doesn't entire causal history affects moral judgment. If determinism is true, then perhaps all luck ultimately reduces to causal luck. The problem of moral luck arises because we seem committed to 2 contradictory principles. 1, people should only be morally judged for what's within their control, and 2 people are often morally judged differently based on factors beyond their control. Consider a classic example. 2 equally drunk drivers head home on similar roads. Due to sheer luck, one encounters a child who darts into the road, resulting in a tragic death. The other encounters no pedestrians and arrives home safely. Though both took the same moral risk in driving drunk, the first driver typically faces much harsher moral and legal judgments based on an outcome that depended partly on luck. Philosophers have proposed various responses to this paradox. Some argue that we should revise our moral judgments to eliminate the influence of luck, judging people solely on their intentions, efforts, or character rather than on outcomes they couldn't control. On this view, the 2 drunk drivers would be equally blameworthy. Others maintain that moral luck is a genuine feature of our moral landscape, reflecting the fact that we are embodied, causally embedded beings whose actions have real consequences in the world. On this view, outcomes matter morally, even when they depend partly on luck. Still, others suggest that our moral practices involve a useful fiction we pretend people have more control than they actually do because treating them as responsible agents promotes social goods and personal development. The problem of moral luck connects to broader questions about fairness, desert, and the relationship between control and responsibility. It challenges us to examine the foundations of our moral judgments and the extent to which those judgments depend on factors that, upon reflection, might seem arbitrary. As you consider moral luck, reflect on cases from your own experience where luck has influenced moral judgments. Have you ever blamed yourself more harshly for an action because it happened to have bad consequences? Have you judged others differently based on outcomes they couldn't fully control? How might recognizing the role of luck affect your approach to praise, blame, resentment, and gratitude? The problem of moral luck reminds us that our moral concepts and practices have evolved in response to practical human needs in a complex, uncertain world, not from pure philosophical principles. It suggests that absolute fairness in moral judgment may be an unreachable ideal, but one that can still guide our thinking about responsibility, blame, and forgiveness. Time and meaning. Zeno's paradoxes. As we transition from questions of morality and responsibility to explorations of time and meaning, let's begin with some of philosophy's oldest and most perplexing thought experiments. Zeno's paradoxes of motion. Zeno of Elea, a pre-Socratic philosopher from the 5th century BCE, developed several arguments that purport to show that motion is impossible. Though seemingly contradicted by our everyday experience of movement, these paradoxes have challenged philosophers and mathematicians for over 2 millennia. Let's examine 3 of Zeno's most famous paradoxes. The dichotomy paradox. Before you can travel a given distance, you must first travel half that distance. But before you can travel half the distance, you must travel a quarter of the distance. Before that, an eighth, and so on, infinitely. Since there are infinitely many points you must reach before arriving at your destination, and it's impossible to complete infinitely many tasks in finite time, motion is impossible. Achilles and the tortoise. The swift hero, Achilles, races a tortoise, giving it a head start. By the time Achilles reaches the tortoise's starting point, the tortoise has moved forward. By the time Achilles reaches that new position, the tortoise has moved forward again. This pattern continues infinitely, suggesting that Achilles can never overtake the tortoise. The arrow paradox. Consider an arrow in flight. At any instant, the arrow occupies a space equal to itself. But occupying a space equal to itself means the arrow is at rest during that instant. If the arrow is at rest at every instant of its flight, when does it move? These paradoxes challenge our understanding of space, time, and infinity. They suggest that either motion is impossible, which contradicts experience, or our conceptual framework for understanding motion is flawed. Modern mathematics provides tools for addressing some aspects of these paradoxes. The development of calculus and the theory of infinite series helps us understand how infinitely many diminishing distances can sum to a finite total, potentially resolving the dichotomy and Achilles paradoxes. For instance, the infinite series 1, 2 plus 1, 4 plus 1, 8 plus approaches but never exceeds 1, suggesting that infinitely many diminishing steps can be completed in finite time or distance. The arrow paradox points to deeper questions about the nature of time and change. Is time composed of indivisible instants, or is it continuous? If time consists of instants without duration, how can change occur in a durationless moment? If time is continuous, how do we account for the present moment and the boundary between past and future? These paradoxes connect to contemporary debates in physics and metaphysics about the nature of space, time, and change. They raise questions about whether space and time are infinitely divisible or composed of discrete minimal units. They challenge us to reconcile our intuitive understanding of motion with rigorous, logical, and mathematical analysis. As you reflect on Zeno's paradoxes, consider how they reveal tensions in our everyday concepts of space, time, and movement. We navigate the world effortlessly, yet when we try to precisely articulate how movement is possible, we encounter perplexing philosophical problems. This suggests that our intuitive understanding of reality sometimes outpaces our ability to conceptualize it clearly. The enduring power of these ancient paradoxes reminds us that even the most basic aspects of our experience, like movement through space and time, contain profound philosophical mysteries when examined closely. The Grandfather Paradox. From ancient puzzles about motion, let's turn to a modern paradox that challenges our understanding of time in a different way. The Grandfather Paradox, a classic problem in the philosophy of time travel. Imagine you invent a time machine and travel back to a time before your father was born. You encounter your paternal grandfather as a young man and, for whatever reason, kill him or otherwise prevent him from meeting your grandmother. As a result, your father is never born, which means you are never born either. But if you were never born, you couldn't have traveled back in time to kill your grandfather in the first place. So your grandfather would have lived, your father would have been born, and you would have been born, two enabling you to go back and kill your grandfather, starting the paradox again. This thought experiment reveals a logical contradiction that seems to arise from the possibility of backwards time travel combined with the ability to change the past. If you can change the past in ways that undermine the very conditions that made your time travel possible, you create a causal loop that cannot be consistently resolved. Philosophers and physicists have proposed several solutions to this paradox. The Novikov self-consistency principle. This approach, developed by physicist Igor Novikov, suggests that time travel is possible, but you cannot change the past in ways that create contradictions. Events would conspire to prevent you from killing your grandfather, your gun would jam, you'd have a change of heart, or some other event would intervene to preserve causal consistency. The multiple timelines. Parallel universes solution. When you travel back in time, you actually enter a different timeline or parallel universe. In this new timeline, you can kill your grandfather without affecting your own timeline of origin. This avoids the contradiction because your existence doesn't depend on events in the new timeline. The block universe view. According to this perspective, from relativistic physics, all moments in time past, present, and future exist equally as part of a four-dimensional block universe. In this view, you cannot change the past because it already includes all time travelers and their actions. If you will travel back to kill your grandfather, then that event is already part of the unchangeable past, which must be consistent with your existence. The Grandfather Paradox connects to broader philosophical questions about the nature of time, causation, free will, and logical possibility. It challenges linear conceptions of time and causal relationships, suggesting that if backwards time travel is possible, our understanding of causation would need significant revision. The paradox also raises questions about personal identity and continuity across time. If you could travel to the past and meet your younger self, how would this affect your understanding of your own identity? Are you the same person as your younger self, or do you stand in some other relation to them? As you reflect on the Grandfather Paradox, consider what it reveals about our concepts of time and causation. We typically think of causes preceding effects in a linear temporal sequence, but time travel scenarios suggest the possibility of causal loops where effects might contribute to their own causes. Such loops challenge our intuitive understanding of explanation, forcing us to reconsider what it means for something to be the cause or reason for something else. While practical time travel remains firmly in the realm of science fiction, thought experiments like the grandfather paradox help us explore the conceptual boundaries of our understanding of time, causation, and possibility, concepts that shape how we make sense of our place in the unfolding history of the world. Eternal return. Let's now explore a profound thought experiment about time, meaning, and existence. Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal return, also called eternal recurrence. In The Gay Science and later works, Friedrich Nietzsche proposed a striking hypothetical. What if you were told that this life, exactly as you've lived it, with every joy and sorrow, every triumph and failure, every moment of exaltation and despair, would repeat infinitely not just similar lives, but this exact same life in every detail, over and over without end? Nietzsche posed this not primarily as a metaphysical theory about how time actually works, but as an existential test and a thought experiment about meaning and affirmation. He asks, how would you respond to this revelation? Would you be crushed by the prospect of infinite repetition, or would you welcome it with joy? For Nietzsche, the appropriate response to eternal return isn't resignation or despair, but enthusiastic affirmation. To truly affirm life is to be able to say, I want this again, exactly as it was, countless times more. This complete affirmation of life, including its suffering and disappointments, represents for Nietzsche the highest possible attitude toward existence. The thought experiment challenges us to reflect on how we value and evaluate our lives. Many of us might wish to change parts of our lives, though, remove regrets, ease suffering, or make different choices. The prospect of eternal return denies us this selective affirmation. It asks whether we can embrace the whole of our existence, including its painful and difficult aspects. Nietzsche connects this idea to his concept of amor, fati love of fate. This isn't passive acceptance or stoic resignation, but active love of necessity, including life's harshest elements. It represents a transformation of perspective where one no longer wishes anything to be different, but embraces the entirety of one's life with gratitude and joy. Beyond personal significance, eternal return raises broader philosophical questions. If everything recurs infinitely, what becomes of concepts like progress, novelty, or ultimate purpose? How do we understand freedom and creativity within endless repetition? Does meaning itself change when situated within cyclical rather than linear time? The idea of eternal return resonates with conceptions of time found in various philosophical and religious traditions. Ancient Greek, Hindu, and Buddhist traditions all include notions of cosmic cycles and rebirth, though they differ significantly from Nietzsche's formulation. More recently, cosmological theories about oscillating universes or multiverses provide scientific frameworks that might give new meaning to cyclical existence. As you contemplate eternal return, consider your own response to Nietzsche's challenge. If you learned that you would live this exact life infinitely many times, how would you feel? What aspects of your life would make this prospect joyful, and what aspects would make it terrifying? How might this thought experiment change how you approach your choices and attitudes in the present? The eternal return invites us to consider the ultimate test of life affirmation. Can you embrace not just selected moments or an idealized version of your life, but your actual existence in its complete reality? Can you transform your relationship to necessity and fate from resentment to love? These questions point us toward what Nietzsche considered the highest possible human achievement, complete and joyful affirmation of life, exactly as it is. Is death bad? Let's turn now to a profound philosophical question that connects issues of time, meaning, and value. Is death bad for the person who dies? While the answer might seem obviously yes, philosophical analysis reveals surprising complexities. The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus presented a provocative argument that death cannot be bad for the person who dies. Death is nothing to us, since when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we do not exist. It is therefore nothing either to the living or to the dead, since it is not present to the living, and the dead no longer exist. This deceptively simple argument highlights a puzzle. How can something be bad for you if you don't exist to experience it? Death seems to remove the very subject who could be harmed by it. Philosophers have offered several responses to this Epicurean challenge. The deprivation account. Death is bad not because of any negative experience, since there is no experience, but because it deprives us of future goods we would otherwise have enjoyed. On this view, death's badness consists in the difference between the value of the life actually lived and the value of the longer life that could have been lived. The desire frustration account. Death is bad because it frustrates our desires for future experiences and achievements. Even if we don't experience this frustration, the fact that our desires go unfulfilled constitutes a harm to our interests. The narrative account. Death can be bad by interrupting the narrative arc of a life before it reaches an appropriate conclusion. A death that comes too soon prevents the completion of projects and relationships that give meaning to a life as a whole. Each of these accounts faces challenges. The deprivation account seems to imply that non-existence before birth is also bad, since it also deprives us of goods. Yet we don't typically regret not having been born earlier. The desire frustration account must explain why the frustration of desires matters if we won't experience that frustration. And the narrative account needs to address how we determine what constitutes an appropriate conclusion to a life. Beyond the question of whether death is bad, philosophers have explored related issues. If death is bad, when exactly does this harm occur? Is death equally bad at any age? Or is its badness related to its timing in a life? Does the inevitability of death make it less bad? And how should awareness of mortality affect how we live? These questions connect to broader philosophical concerns about the nature of harm, personal identity over time, and the relationship between experience and well-being. They challenge us to clarify what we value about existence and what gives meaning to the finite lives we have. Different philosophical and religious traditions offer varied perspectives on death. Some religious views frame death as a transition rather than an end, potentially transforming its significance. Existentialist philosophers often argue that confronting mortality is essential for authentic living, making possible a clearer understanding of our values and choices. Buddhist perspectives suggest that attachment to continued existence is itself a source of suffering, and that accepting impermanence leads to greater peace. As you reflect on the badness of death, consider not just abstract arguments, but your own attitudes toward mortality. When you imagine your own death, what aspects seem most troubling? Is it the prospect of non-existence itself, the cutting short of future possibilities, the interruption of ongoing projects, or perhaps the impact on loved ones? How might clarifying these concerns affect your understanding of what makes life valuable in the face? Part 2. Moral landscapes. Classical moral dilemmas. The trolley problem. As we transition from questions of existence and knowledge to the moral dimension of philosophical inquiry, let's begin with perhaps the most famous ethical thought experiment of our time, the trolley problem. In its original form, presented by philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967, the scenario asks you to imagine that you're standing by a set of train tracks when you notice an out-of-control trolley barreling down the line. Ahead on the tracks are 5 people who cannot escape in time. You stand next to a lever that can divert the trolley to a different track, but there's one person on that alternative track who would be killed if you pull the lever. The question is, should you pull the lever? Many people feel an intuitive pull to say yes better, to save 5 lives at the cost of 1. This reasoning aligns with consequentialism, the ethical framework that judges actions based on their outcomes or consequences. From a purely consequentialist perspective, the math seems straightforward. Saving 5 lives at the cost of 1 creates a net saving of 4 lives. But now, consider a variation of this scenario proposed by Judith Jarvis Thomson. In this version, you're standing on a footbridge over the trolley tracks. The runaway trolley is approaching, and again, it will kill 5 people if it continues on its course. This time, there's a very large person standing next to you on the bridge. If you push this person off the bridge onto the tracks, their body will stop the trolley, saving the 5 people, but killing the person you pushed. Would you push the large person? Many people who would pull the lever in the first scenario balk at pushing the person in the second, even though the mathematical outcome is identical. 1 person dies instead of 5. What explains this difference in our moral intuitions? Some suggest that the difference lies in the means by which the 1 person dies. In the lever case, the death of the 1 person is a foreseen but unintended side effect of saving the 5. In the footbridge case, you use the death of the 1 person as a means to save the 5. You must intend their death for your plan to work. This distinction between intended and merely foreseen consequences is central to the doctrine of double effect, an important concept in deontological ethics. Others point to the difference in personal involvement. Pulling a lever creates psychological distance from the outcome, while physically pushing someone involves direct, personal force. Our moral intuitions seem sensitive to these variations in how we cause harm, even when the end results are identical. The trolley problem has spawned countless variations, each designed to probe different aspects of our moral intuitions. What if the 1 person on the sidetrack is a brilliant doctor who would otherwise save thousands of lives? What if the 5 people on the main track are convicted murderers? What if the 1 person is someone you love? These variations reveal something important about our moral thinking. It's not guided by a single, simple principle like minimize harm or never use people as mere means. Instead, our moral judgments reflect a complex interplay of different values, principles, and intuitions that sometimes come into tension with each other. In recent years, the trolley problem has taken on new relevance as we develop autonomous vehicles. Self-driving cars might someday face real-world versions of trolley-like dilemmas. If a crash is unavoidable, should the car be programmed to minimize total casualties, even if that means swerving to hit fewer people rather than more? Should it prioritize the safety of its passengers over pedestrians? These are no longer mere philosophical thought experiments, but practical engineering and policy questions. As you reflect on the trolley problem, notice your own intuitive responses to the different variations. What principles or values seem to be guiding your judgments? Are they consistent across cases, or do they shift depending on the details? The trolley problem doesn't have a single right answer, but exploring our responses to it can reveal much about the complex nature of moral reasoning itself. The experience machine. From questions about causing harm, let's turn to a thought experiment that challenges our understanding of happiness, pleasure, and the good life. Robert Nozick's experience machine. Imagine that neuroscientists have developed a remarkable technology, a machine that can give you any experience you desire. Once connected to this machine, electrodes stimulate your brain to provide the perfect simulation of whatever life you consider most desirable. You might choose to experience writing a great novel, falling in love, climbing Mount Everest, or reconciling with an estranged friend, and the simulation would be indistinguishable from the real thing. From inside the machine, you would have no idea that your experiences weren't really happening. The scientists guarantee that while in the machine, you would experience only pleasure and satisfaction. They promise that the machine is perfectly reliable and that your body would be well maintained while your mind lives in this simulated paradise. You could even pre-program a variety of experiences to ensure you never get bored. Here's the catch. Once you enter the machine, you can never leave. You must decide, once and for all, whether to plug into a lifetime of guaranteed happiness and pleasure, or to remain in the real world with all its pain, suffering, disappointment, and uncertainty. Nozick posed this thought experiment in his 1974 book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, to challenge utilitarian theories that identify the good with pleasure or happiness. If pleasure were the only thing that mattered, he reasoned, then the choice would be obvious very one should plug into the experience machine. Yet most people, when confronted with this scenario, feel reluctant to plug in. This reluctance suggests that we value something beyond just pleasurable experiences. What might those other values be? Nozick suggests several possibilities. First, we seem to care about actually doing things, not just having the experience of doing them. There's a difference between actually writing a great novel and merely having the experience of having written one. The achievement itself matters, not just the feeling of achievement. Second, we want to be certain kinds of people, not just to have certain kinds of experiences. Being courageous or kind or wise matters to us, not just feeling as if we have these qualities. The experience machine might give us the illusion of being virtuous without the reality. Third, we desire contact with a deeper reality beyond our own minds. Even if a simulation could perfectly replicate all sensory experiences, there would still be something missing. Genuine connection with an external world that exists independently of our perceptions and desires. The experience machine raises profound questions about what makes a life good or worth living. Is authentic connection with reality important even if it involves suffering? Do we value truth for its own sake, apart from any pleasure or pain it might bring? Is there a meaningful difference between genuine achievement and the perfect subjective experience of achievement? These questions become increasingly relevant in our world of advanced virtual reality, social media filters, and immersive digital experiences. When we can curate and manipulate our experiences to an unprecedented degree, we face smaller versions of the experience machine dilemma every day. How much reality are we willing to trade for pleasure or the avoidance of discomfort? The experience machine also connects to ancient philosophical concerns. Plato's allegory of the cave asks whether we would choose a comfortable illusion over a sometimes painful reality. Stoic philosophers distinguished between preferred indifference, like pleasure and health, and the true good of virtue and wisdom. The Buddhist tradition examines the nature of desire and satisfaction, questioning whether any experience, real or simulated, can provide lasting happiness. As you consider whether you would enter the experience machine, reflect on what your choice reveals about your deepest values. What matters to you beyond subjective experiences of pleasure and happiness? What would you be unwilling to sacrifice even for a lifetime of guaranteed bliss? The Drowning Child. Let's now turn to a powerful thought experiment that challenges our intuitions about moral obligation and the limits of our responsibility to help others. Peter Singer's Drowning Child. Imagine you're walking past a shallow pond and notice a small child drowning in it. You could easily wade in and pull the child out, but doing so would ruin the expensive clothes you're wearing. Would you save the child? Most people answer immediately that of course they would save the child. The cost of ruined clothing seems trivial compared to a child's life. Few would hesitate even for a moment when faced with this situation. Now Singer asks us to consider another scenario. You receive a letter from a reputable international aid organization explaining that for just $200, you could save a child's life in a developing country by providing essential medicine or nutrition. Would you send the money? Many people who would unhesitatingly ruin an expensive outfit to save a drowning child might pause at the request for a donation. Yet Singer argues that the moral situations are relevantly similar. In both cases, you can save a child's life at relatively little cost to yourself. What explains this difference in our responses? Singer suggests several possibilities, none of which he thinks are morally relevant. The drowning child is physically present, while distant children in need are abstract and faceless. But why should physical proximity matter morally? With the drowning child, you're the only one who can help, while with global poverty, responsibility seems diffused among many potential donors. But does the existence of other people who could help, but aren't, reduce your own obligation? The connection between your action and saving the drowning child is direct and certain, while the causal path from your donation to saving a life might seem less clear. But if we have good evidence that our donations will effectively help, should this uncertainty matter? For Singer, these differences don't justify our different responses. If we accept the principle that we should prevent something bad from happening, when we can do so without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, a principle that seems to justify saving the drowning child, then we should also donate substantially to effective aid organizations. This argument leads to a radical conclusion. Those of us living in affluence have strong moral obligations to help those in extreme poverty. Obligations that might require significant changes to our lifestyles and priorities. Our failure to donate more to effective charities, on this view, isn't merely a missed opportunity to do something nice. It's a serious moral failing comparable to walking past the drowning child. Critics of Singer's argument point to various disanalogies between the two cases. Some argue that our special obligations to those physically present to us have deep evolutionary and psychological roots that cannot be easily dismissed. Others suggest that the institutional and systemic nature of global poverty requires collective political solutions rather than just individual charity. The drowning child thought experiment connects to broader questions about the demands of morality. How much can morality legitimately demand of us? Are there limits to the sacrifices we're required to make for strangers? Does the existence of significant suffering in the world mean that many of the things we consider morally neutral, like buying luxury goods or saving for our own retirement, are actually morally wrong? As you reflect on Singer's argument, consider how it applies to your own life and choices. If you accept the intuition that you should save the drowning child at the cost of your clothes, how should that affect your response to distant suffering that you could alleviate at similar cost? Where do you draw the line between what morality requires and what is merely praiseworthy but optional? The ticking time bomb. Now, let's explore a controversial thought experiment. that has shaped real-world debates about the ethics of torture. The ticking time bomb scenario. Imagine that a terrorist has planted a nuclear bomb in the heart of a major city. The bomb is set to detonate in a few hours, potentially killing millions of people. The authorities have captured someone who they have strong reason to believe knows the location of the bomb but refuses to reveal it. The only way to obtain this information in time to save the city, according to this scenario, is through torture. The question is, would torture be morally permissible in this case? This thought experiment presents a stark conflict between deontological ethical frameworks, which hold that certain actions, like torture, are inherently wrong regardless of their consequences, and consequentialist frameworks, which judge actions based on their outcomes. A strict deontologist might maintain that torture is always wrong, even if it would save millions of lives. A consequentialist might argue that the moral imperative to save millions outweighs the prohibition against torture in this extreme case. The ticking time bomb scenario is designed to elicit consequentialist intuitions by maximizing both the certainty and the magnitude of the good consequences while minimizing the harm. In its standard formulation, we're asked to assume that we know with certainty that the suspect has the relevant information. We know with certainty that torture will yield this information in time. We know with certainty that the information will allow us to prevent the catastrophe. There is no other way to obtain the information in time. The harm prevented millions of deaths vastly outweighs the harm inflicted torture of one person. Critics of the scenario point out that these assumptions never hold in real-world situations. We can never be certain that a suspect has the relevant information or that torture will reliably extract it. Indeed, evidence suggests that torture often produces false information, as victims say, whatever they think will make the pain stop. The scenario artificially removes the uncertainty, institutional context, and long-term consequences that would be relevant to any real-world decision about torture. Moreover, critics argue that the scenario ignores the institutional and societal effects of legitimizing torture even in extreme cases. Once we allow exceptions to the prohibition against torture, we risk a slippery slope toward its more widespread use. The moral cost isn't just the suffering of the tortured individual, but the corruption of legal systems, the degradation of democratic values, and the erosion of human rights norms. The ticking time bomb scenario gained practical importance after the September 11, 2001 attacks, when it was invoked to justify enhanced interrogation techniques used on terrorism suspects. This real-world application demonstrates how philosophical thought experiments can shape policy discussions, for better or worse. The scenario also connects to deeper questions about moral absolutes versus moral trade-offs. Are there some actions that are wrong regardless of their consequences? If we accept that extreme circumstances can justify extreme measures, how do we prevent the exception from swallowing the rule? And how should we think about moral decision-making under conditions of uncertainty, where we can never be as confident about outcomes as the ticking time bomb scenario suggests? As you reflect on this thought experiment, consider not just your initial response to the scenario as presented, but also how your view might change if the artificial certainty were removed. Would your position change if there were only a 50% chance that the suspect had the information, or a 30% chance that torture would yield reliable information in time? How confident would you need to be to justify an action you would otherwise consider morally impermissible? The violinist. Let's now examine a thought experiment that has played a central role in philosophical debates about abortion. Judith Jarvis Thomson's famous violinist case. Imagine that you wake up one morning to find yourself connected by medical tubes to a famous violinist. You learn that the violinist has a fatal kidney condition, and the Society of Music Lovers has kidnapped you because you alone have the right blood type to help. They have connected the violinist's circulatory system to yours so that your kidneys can filter his blood as well as your own. A doctor tells you that the violinist needs to remain connected to you for 9 months, after which he will have recovered and can be safely disconnected. To disconnect him sooner would be to cause his death. The question Thompson poses is, are you morally obligated to remain connected to the violinist for 9 months? Many people intuitively feel that, while it might be generous and praiseworthy to agree to remain connected, you are not morally required to do so. The violinist may have a right to life, but that right doesn't entail a right to use your body without your consent, even if disconnection would result in his death. Thompson developed this thought experiment to challenge a common argument against abortion that proceeds from the premise that a fetus has a right to life to the conclusion that abortion is impermissible. She grants, for the sake of argument, that a fetus has a full right to life from the moment of conception, but argues that this right to life doesn't necessarily include the right to use another person's body against their will. Just as the violinist's right to life doesn't obligate you to remain connected to him for 9 months, Thompson argues, a fetus's right to life, even if granted, doesn't necessarily obligate a woman to continue a pregnancy she doesn't consent to. The violinist case is specifically designed to parallel pregnancies resulting from rape, where there is a clear lack of consent to the initial situation. Thompson offers other analogies for pregnancies where contraception fails or where continuing the pregnancy would risk the woman's life. Critics of the analogy point to various disanalogies between pregnancy and the violinist scenario. In most pregnancies, except rape, the woman has engaged in an activity knowing it might result in pregnancy, unlike the violinist case where you bear no responsibility for the initial situation. The relationship between a woman and her fetus is a natural biological one between mother and child, not an artificial connection between strangers. Disconnecting from the violinist is more analogous to letting die, removing life support, than to actively killing, which some argue is more similar to certain abortion procedures. Thompson anticipates and responds to some of these objections in her paper. She argues that consent to sex is not necessarily consent to pregnancy, just as consent to open a window doesn't mean consenting to a burglar entering your house. She also develops additional thought experiments to address pregnancies where the woman bears some responsibility for the situation. The violinist thought experiment highlights the importance of bodily autonomy in our moral thinking. Even if we grant that a fetus, or the violinist, has a full right to life, there remains a question about the extent to which that right can make claims on another person's body. The case invites us to consider the scope and limits of our bodily obligations to others, even when others' lives depend on us. As you reflect on this thought experiment, consider how your intuitions about the violinist case align or conflict with your views on abortion and other issues involving bodily autonomy. What principles underlie your judgment about whether you would be obligated to remain connected to the violinist? How might those principles apply to other contexts where one person's life or well-being depends on another's bodily sacrifice? The Ring of Gyges. Having explored contemporary moral dilemmas, let's turn to one of the oldest philosophical thought experiments about morality and human nature. The Ring of Gyges, from Plato's Republic. In this ancient thought experiment, Glaucon, Plato's brother, tells the story of a shepherd named Gyges, who discovers a magical ring that makes him invisible when he turns it. Using this power of invisibility, Gyges seduces the queen, murders the king, and takes over the kingdom. Glaucon uses this story to pose a challenging question. If we could act with perfect impunity, if we could do whatever we wanted without anyone knowing or being able to hold us accountable, would we still have any reason to be just or moral? To sharpen the thought experiment, Glaucon asks us to imagine two magical rings, one that would make a just person invisible and one that would make an unjust person invisible. He suggests that any person, no matter how seemingly virtuous, would use the power of invisibility to take what they want, indulge their desires, and act unjustly. This leads to his provocative claim. People act justly only because they fear punishment or seek reputation, not because justice is desirable in itself. This thought experiment challenges us to examine the foundations of our moral behavior. Do we act morally because we recognize the intrinsic value of justice and goodness? Or do we act morally only because of external constraints, the fear of punishment, the desire for reputation, or the need for social cooperation? Socrates, as portrayed by Plato, rejects Glaucon's cynical view. He argues that justice is not merely instrumentally valuable for its social benefits, but is intrinsically good for the person who possesses it. A just soul, for Socrates, is a harmonious and healthy soul, while an unjust soul is disordered and ultimately unhappy. The Ring of Gyges raises profound questions about human nature and motivation. Are we fundamentally self-interested beings who cooperate only out of necessity? Or do we have natural moral capacities, empathy, fairness, care for others that would guide our behavior even without external constraints? The thought experiment also invites us to consider what it means to be truly moral. Is morality primarily about compliance with rules and norms, or about developing a certain kind of character? Socrates suggests that the truly just person would not use the ring for unjust purposes because they understand that injustice harms the doer as much as the victim. Justice, for Socrates, is not just about what we do, but about who we are. Modern versions of the Ring of Gyges question appear in various forms. What would you do if you knew with certainty that no one would ever discover your action? How do you behave when you're anonymous online? Why do people sometimes act differently when they're in a foreign city where no one knows them? These questions connect to contemporary research in psychology and behavioral economics about human altruism, cooperation, and moral development. Studies of anonymous charitable giving, cooperation in one-shot games with strangers, and moral behavior in the absence of reputational incentives all provide empirical perspectives on the ancient question Glaucon posed. As you reflect on the Ring of Gyges, consider how you might use such a ring if you possessed it. Would you be tempted to use it for personal gain or to harm others? What does your answer reveal about your view of morality's foundations? And how might your behavior change if you truly believed, like Socrates, that unjust actions harm the doer's soul regardless of whether they're detected by others? Justice and society. The veil of ignorance. As we transition from classical moral dilemmas to questions of justice and social organization, let's explore one of the most influential thought experiments in political philosophy, John Rawls's veil of ignorance. In his groundbreaking 1971 book, A Theory of Justice, Rawls proposed a thought experiment designed to help us think about principles of justice from an impartial perspective. He asks us to imagine a hypothetical, original position in which we must design the basic structure of society's major political, economic, and social institutions without knowing what position we will occupy in that society. Behind this veil of ignorance, we don't know our race, gender, social class, natural talents, health status, or even our personal conception of the good life. We don't know if we'll be born into wealth or poverty, privilege or disadvantage, with extraordinary abilities or disabilities. The veil ensures that we cannot tailor the principles of justice to benefit our particular situation. Under these conditions, Rawls argues, rational, self-interested individuals would choose principles of justice that Guarantee equal basic liberties for all, like freedom of speech, religion, and political participation. Ensure that social and economic inequalities are A. Attached to positions open to all under fair equality of opportunity. B. Arrange to benefit the least advantaged members of society. The difference principle. When we don't know what position we'll occupy in society, Rawls suggests, we wouldn't gamble on principles that might leave us severely disadvantaged. Instead, we'd adopt a maximin strategy, maximizing the minimum position to ensure that even the worst-off position in society is as good as it can be. The Veil of Ignorance thought experiment offers a powerful method for thinking about justice impartially. When designing institutions, it asks us to consider not just what benefits us personally in our current circumstances, but what would be acceptable to us if we might end up in any position in society. Critics of Rawls challenge his thought experiment on various grounds. Some argue that people might be more risk-taking behind the veil than Rawls assumes, potentially accepting greater inequality for the chance of being better off. Others suggest that the thought experiment still smuggles in certain liberal assumptions about the nature of persons in society. And some critics note that the artificial conditions of the original position, especially the absence of particular cultural and historical identities, might make the resulting principles too abstract to guide real-world political decisions. Despite these criticisms, the Veil of Ignorance has become a widely used tool for thinking about justice across the political spectrum. It resonates with moral intuitions many of us share, that fair rules are ones we would accept regardless of our particular position, and that just institutions should not simply reflect the interests of the powerful. The Veil of Ignorance connects to broader philosophical questions about impartiality, fairness, and the nature of moral reasoning. It suggests that moral judgments should be universalizable, acceptable from any perspective rather than based on arbitrary features of our situation. This view has roots in Kant's moral philosophy and finds echoes in many religious and cultural traditions that emphasize putting oneself in others' positions. As you reflect on the Veil of Ignorance, consider how it might apply to specific social questions. What healthcare system would you design if you didn't know your health status or financial situation? What educational policies would you support if you didn't know your natural talents or socioeconomic background? What immigration policies would you favor if you didn't know what country you would be born in? The Veil of Ignorance invites us to step back from our particular circumstances and interest to consider what principles all of us, as free and equal persons, could reasonably accept as the basis for our shared social world. The Prisoner's Dilemma. From questions of ideal justice, let's turn to a thought experiment that illuminates the challenges of cooperation in the real world. The Prisoner's Dilemma. Imagine two suspects, arrested for a crime, who are held in separate cells with no way to communicate. The prosecutor offers each prisoner the same deal. If you confess and testify against your partner, while your partner stays silent, you'll go free and your partner will receive a 10-year sentence. If both of you stay silent, you'll each get just 1 year on a minor charge. If both of you confess, you'll each get 5 years. Each prisoner must decide whether to cooperate with their partner by staying silent or defect by confessing and testifying against their partner without knowing what the other will choose. From the perspective of pure self-interest, each prisoner faces the following calculation. If my partner stays silent, I'm better off confessing, going free rather than serving 1 year. If my partner confesses, I'm still better off confessing, serving 5 years rather than 10. So regardless of what my partner does, my self-interest seems to dictate that I should confess. But here's the paradox. If both prisoners follow this logic and confess, they each get 5 years. If they had both stayed silent, they would each get only 1 year. Individual rationality leads to an outcome that is worse for both than if they had cooperated. The prisoner's dilemma illuminates a fundamental tension between individual and collective rationality. Actions that make sense from each individual's perspective can lead to outcomes that are worse for everyone involved. This pattern appears in many real-world situations involving cooperation and collective action. Consider these examples. Arms races. Each country might be better off building weapons, regardless of what other countries do, but all countries might prefer a world with fewer weapons and lower military spending. Environmental protection. Each company might be better off not investing in expensive pollution controls, regardless of what other companies do, but all companies might prefer operating in a cleaner environment with sustainable resources. Public goods. Each individual might be better off not contributing to community projects, regardless of what others do. But everyone might prefer living in a community with well-funded public services. What makes these situations dilemmas is that the collectively rational outcome, cooperation, is unstable. Each individual has an incentive to defect, even when others cooperate. This helps explain why cooperation can be difficult to establish and maintain, even when it would benefit everyone involved. Game theorists and social scientists have extensively studied the prisoner's dilemma and its variations. One key insight comes from examining iterated versions of the game, where the same players interact repeatedly. In these situations, strategies like tit for tat cooperate initially, then do whatever your partner did in the previous round, can help establish and maintain cooperation by creating consequences for defection. The prisoner's dilemma has important connections to political philosophy. Thomas Hobbes's argument for the necessity of a sovereign, Leviathan, can be understood as a response to a multi-person prisoner's dilemma in the state of nature, where cooperation without enforcement leads to vulnerability. Modern contractarians like David Gautier have developed sophisticated theories about how rational agents might overcome prisoners' dilemmas through binding agreements and reputation mechanisms. The dilemma also raises questions about the nature of rationality itself. Is it truly rational to pursue narrow self-interest when doing so leads to worse outcomes for oneself? Some philosophers argue that we need broader conceptions of rationality that include commitments, relationships, and moral principles, not just maximization of individual utility. As you reflect on the prisoner's dilemma, consider how it might apply to cooperation problems in your own life and community. When have you faced situations where individual incentives pulled against collective welfare? What mechanisms trust, communication, rules, sanctions helped, or could have helped, establish cooperation? What does the persistence of such dilemmas tell us about the challenges of building just and flourishing societies? The tragedy of the commons. Related to the prisoner's dilemma, but with its own distinctive features, is another powerful model of social cooperation problems, the tragedy of the commons. This thought experiment, introduced by ecologist Garrett Hardin in 1968, asks us to imagine a common pasture open to all herders in a village. Each herder can choose how many cattle to graze on the commons. The benefit of adding one more animal accrues entirely to the individual herder, through sales of milk and meat, while the cost of overgrazing is distributed across all users of the commons as the pasture deteriorates. From each herder's perspective, adding one more animal is rational. They receive the full benefit of that animal, while bearing only a fraction of the environmental cost. But if all herders follow this logic, the result is overgrazing, depletion of the commons, and ultimately ruin for everyone. Hardin used this model to illustrate problems with managing shared resources, from fisheries and forests to clean air and water. When many individuals have access to a limited resource, and each acts according to their narrow self-interest, the resource can be depleted or destroyed, leaving everyone worse off. The tragedy of the commons differs from the prisoner's dilemma in important ways. While the prisoner's dilemma involves a one-time choice between two options, cooperate or defect, the commons problem typically involves multiple actors making continuous decisions about resource use over time. The prisoner's dilemma is often presented as a problem of cooperation between two individuals, while the commons highlights the challenges of sustaining cooperation among many users of a shared resource. Hardin's original conclusion was pessimistic. He argued that commons problems could only be solved through mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, essentially through privatization of the commons or strict governmental regulation. The logic of individual advantage would otherwise inexorably lead to resource depletion. However, subsequent research by political economist Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for her work, revealed a more nuanced picture. Studying real-world commons around the globe, Ostrom found that communities often develop sophisticated governance systems to manage shared resources sustainably. These systems typically involve clear boundaries, monitoring, graduated sanctions for rule breakers, conflict resolution mechanisms, and local decision-making authority. The tragedy of the commons connects to profound questions about human nature, social organization, and our relationship with the natural world. Are humans inevitably short-sighted and self-interested, or can we develop the institutions and values needed for long-term sustainability? How should we balance individual freedom with the need for collective resource management? What forms of governance best support sustainable use of shared resources? These questions have taken on new urgency in our era of global environmental challenges. Climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, and other planetary-scale problems can be understood as tragedies of the commons playing out at the global level. The atmosphere's limited capacity to absorb greenhouse gases, for instance, is a commons that all nations share but that no single nation has sufficient incentive to protect. As you reflect on the tragedy of the commons, consider how it applies to resources you share with others, from public parks and roads to the global climate. What governance mechanisms help prevent overuse of these resources? How do values like fairness, reciprocity, and concern for future generations influence your own use of shared resources? And what lessons might we draw from successful commons management for addressing larger environmental challenges? Utility monsters and experience machines revisited. Let's deepen our exploration of utilitarian ethics by examining two thought experiments that challenge the principle of maximizing overall happiness or well-being: the utility monster and a variation on the experience machine. First, the utility monster, proposed by philosopher Robert Nozick. Imagine a being that gets vastly more utility, pleasure, happiness, satisfaction from resources than ordinary humans do. This creature might derive 1,000 times more pleasure from eating a cookie than you would, or 1,000,000 times more satisfaction from reading a book. According to a simple utilitarian calculus that aims to maximize total utility, we should transfer resources from ordinary people to the utility monster, even to the point of extreme deprivation for the many, because this would produce more total utility in the world. If the monster gets 1,000,000 units of utility from resources that would give 1,000 people 1 unit each, the utilitarian calculator would favor the monster. This conclusion strikes many people as deeply unjust. It seems to violate our intuition that each person's well-being matters and that extreme sacrifices shouldn't be demanded of many people to slightly benefit one, no matter how efficiently that one person converts resources to utility. The utility monster reveals a potential problem with utilitarian approaches that focus solely on maximizing the total or average amount of utility without considering its distribution. It suggests that we need to incorporate other values like fairness, equality, or respect for each person's separate existence into our moral framework. Now, let's return to the experience machine with a social twist. Imagine that neuroscientists have developed a technology that can give most people in society the subjective experience of a good life, love, achievement, pleasure, while in reality they're just floating in tanks, experiencing a simulation. A small group of technicians remains outside the simulation to maintain the machines. This arrangement maximizes overall happiness in the society. The vast majority experience subjective well-being, while only the small group of technicians must deal with reality, which includes maintaining the limited resources needed to sustain the tanks. Would this be a just or desirable society? Many would argue no, even if it maximized total happiness. This suggests that we value things beyond just subjective experience truth, authentic achievement, genuine human connection, and contact with reality. Together, these thought experiments challenge purely consequentialist approaches to ethics and social organization. They suggest that while outcomes matter morally, they aren't the only things that matter. Principles like justice, fairness, truth, and respect for persons seem to have independent moral importance beyond their contribution to overall happiness or utility. Paradoxes of time. The nature of the present moment. As we enter our final hour of philosophical exploration, let's begin by examining one of the most immediate yet elusive aspects of our experience, the present moment. The present seems fundamentally different from the past and future. It's where we live, where consciousness happens, where choices are made. Yet when we try to pin down exactly what the present is, it proves remarkably difficult to grasp. Consider this puzzle. If time is composed of instants, how long does the present instant last? If it has any duration at all, say, a second or a millisecond, then it contains earlier and later parts, which means it's not truly an indivisible now. But if the present has no duration, if it's a mere boundary between past and future with zero temporal thickness, how can we experience it? How can anything happen in a durationless instant? This dilemma echoes Zeno's paradoxes and points to a fundamental tension in how we understand time. Our experience suggests that the present has some duration. It feels like we inhabit a specious present that contains at least a brief stretch of time, allowing us to hear a musical note or observe motion. Yet, logical analysis suggests that any duration, no matter how short, must contain earlier and later parts and thus cannot be a true, indivisible present. This puzzle deepens when we consider how the present relates to space. According to Einstein's theory of relativity, there is no universal now that extends throughout the cosmos. Because simultaneity is relative to reference frames, what counts as present for observers in different states of motion will differ. Events that are simultaneous, and thus both present, for one observer may be non-simultaneous, one past, one future for another. This challenges the intuitive view that there's a single, objective present moment that sweeps through the universe. Philosophers have responded to these puzzles with various theories of time. Presentism holds that only present objects and events exist. The past and future are not real in the same sense as the present. This view aligns with common intuition but faces challenges from physics, which treats past, present, and future as equally real parts of a four-dimensional spacetime. The growing block theory suggests that the past and present exist, but the future does not. Reality grows as present moments become past, creating an ever-expanding block of existence that has a leading edge, the present, but no future component. Eternalism, or the block universe theory, holds that past, present, and future are equally real. All times exist, tenselessly, in a four-dimensional space-time. On this view, the sense of a privileged now moving through time is a psychological feature of consciousness, not an objective feature of reality. The moving spotlight theory combines elements of eternalism with the idea of an objective present, suggesting that while all times exist, there is still a privileged now that moves through the block universe like a spotlight. These theories have different implications for questions about change, identity over time, free will, and the significance of temporal perspectives. They challenge us to reconcile our subjective experience of time with its flowing present and sharp distinction between past and future with scientific and philosophical analyses that suggest a more complex picture. As you reflect on the nature of the present moment, consider your own experience of time. Do you feel that you exist only in the present? Or do your memories and anticipations give you a kind of partial existence in past and future as well? Does the idea that the present might be a psychological construct rather than an objective feature of the world change how you relate to time? And how does awareness of these puzzles affect your understanding of what it means to be a temporal being, existing in and through time? The elusive nature of the present reminds us that even our most basic and intimate experiences, like the feeling of existing now, can harbor deep philosophical mysteries when examined closely. The arrow of time. From the puzzle of the present, let's turn to another fundamental aspect of time: its apparent directionality, or arrow. Time seems to flow in one direction from past to future, and this asymmetry shapes our experience in profound ways. We remember the past, but not the future. Causes precede their effects. Entropy, roughly disorder or randomness, increases over time. Eggs break, but don't unbreak. Coffee cools, but doesn't spontaneously heat up. Wrinkles form, but don't disappear. These asymmetries all point in the same temporal direction, giving time a structure that distinguishes it from space, which has no inherent directionality. Yet this temporal asymmetry presents a puzzle. The fundamental laws of physics are, with minor exceptions, time-symmetric. They work equally well forward or backward. If you were to watch a video of two billiard balls colliding, you likely couldn't tell whether the video was playing forward or in reverse, because both directions are consistent with the laws of mechanics. So where does time's arrow come from? The most widely accepted explanation connects time's arrow to entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, which states that in closed systems, entropy tends to increase over time. The reason eggs break but don't unbreak isn't that unbreaking would violate the laws of physics, it's that there are vastly more ways for an egg to be broken than to be intact. So random physical processes overwhelmingly favor the broken state. This statistical explanation traces time's arrow to the universe's initial conditions, a low-entropy state at or near the Big Bang. But this explanation shifts the puzzle, rather than resolving it. Why was the early universe in such an improbable, low-entropy state? Some cosmologists have proposed that our observable universe is just one region in a larger multiverse, and that the apparent arrow of time in our region is a local, contingent phenomenon rather than a universal feature of reality. Beyond physics, the arrow of time manifests in our psychological and phenomenological experience. We feel ourselves moving from past to future, not the reverse. Memory, anticipation, regret, hope, planning all presuppose time's asymmetric flow. Some philosophers argue that our sense of time's direction is fundamentally linked to agency and intentionality. Your ability to deliberate about possible futures and act to bring some possibilities about rather than others. Different philosophical traditions have offered varied perspectives on time's directionality. Ancient Greek thinkers like Parmenides questioned whether change in time were real at all, suggesting that true reality is unchanging and eternal. Eastern traditions often emphasize cyclical conceptions of time, where linear directionality is embedded within larger cosmic cycles. Modern physics presents a complex picture where time's arrow emerges from timeless laws operating on particular initial conditions. The arrow of time also connects to puzzles about causation. We typically think of causes preceding their effects, but some interpretations of physics, particularly in quantum mechanics, allow for retrocausality effects preceding their causes. Such possibilities challenge our intuitive understanding of temporal order and causal relationships. As you reflect on time's arrow, consider how deeply it structures your experience and understanding. How do your attitudes toward past and future differ? How does the irreversibility of time, the fact that moments once past cannot be revisited or change, shape your approach to decision-making, regret, and hope? And how might your perspective shift if you viewed time's apparent flow not as an intrinsic feature of reality, but as emerging from deeper, timeless principles? The puzzle of time's arrow reminds us that our most basic experiences of temporal asymmetry may ultimately depend on cosmological conditions and statistical principles that lie far beyond our everyday understanding. McTaggart's paradox. Let's delve now into a more technical but profound puzzle about the nature of time. McTaggart's paradox, developed by philosopher J.M.E. McTaggart in his 1908 paper, The Unreality of Time. McTaggart distinguished two ways of ordering events in time. The A-series orders events according to their tensed properties, whether they are past, present, or future. This corresponds to our ordinary way of experiencing time, where events move from being future to present to past. The B-series orders events according to their fixed temporal relations, whether one event is earlier than, simultaneous with, or later than another. This corresponds to the way we might represent time on a timeline, where temporal relations between events don't change. McTaggart argued that the A-series is essential to our concept of time. Without the distinction between past, present, and future, we wouldn't have genuine change, just a static array of events in fixed relations. But he then attempted to show that the A-series leads to contradiction and therefore cannot be real. His argument goes something like this. Every event must have all three temporal properties being past, present, and future essence. An event that is present was future and will be past. But these properties are incompatibleno. Event can simultaneously be past, present, and future. To avoid contradiction, we might say that events have these properties successively, rather than simultaneously. An event is first future, then present, then past. But this appeal to succession presupposes the A-series we're trying to explain, creating a circularity or infinite regress. McTaggart concluded that time as we ordinarily conceive it, with events moving from future to present to past, involves contradiction and therefore cannot be real. The B-series alone, he argued, cannot account for genuine change, since the relations earlier than and later than are fixed and unchanging. Therefore, he concluded, time itself is unreal. Philosophers have responded to McTaggart's paradox in various ways. A-theorists defend the reality of tensed properties, past, present, future, by arguing that events don't possess all these properties simultaneously or even successively. Rather, events acquire and lose temporal properties as the objective present moves through time. An event's being present isn't a property it has permanently, but one it has only at a certain time. B theorists accept McTaggart's critique of the A series but deny his claim that the B series alone cannot account for change. They argue that change can be understood as different properties holding at different times, without appeal to tensed properties or a moving present. Some philosophers have developed hybrid theories that attempt to capture elements of both A and B series, or that reconceptualize time in ways that avoid McTaggart's paradox altogether. McTaggart's paradox connects to broader questions about the nature of change, existence through time, and the relationship between language and reality. It challenges us to clarify what we mean by statements like, "The meeting is tomorrow," or "My childhood is past." Do such statements refer to objective features of reality, or merely express our subjective temporal perspective? The paradox also relates to the scientific understanding of time. Einstein's relativity theory, which treats time as a dimension integrated with space, seems more compatible with B-series conceptions where temporal relations are fixed than with A-series views that posit an objective, universal present moving through time. As you consider McTaggart's paradox, reflect on your own conception of time. Do you think of events as objectively having the properties of pastness, presentness, or futurity? Or do you think of temporal properties as relations between events or between events and observers? Does the idea that time as we ordinarily conceive it might be in some sense unreal or illusory resonate with insights from physics, psychology, or other philosophical traditions? This paradox reminds us that concepts we use unproblematically in everyday life, like the flow of time, from future to present to past, can harbor subtle contradictions when subjected to rigorous philosophical analysis. Time travel and personal identity. We've already explored some logical puzzles involving time travel, like the grandfather paradox. Let's now examine how time travel scenarios challenge our understanding of personal identity. What makes someone the same person over time? Imagine a scenario where future you travels back in time and meets present you. This creates several philosophical puzzles. Numerical identity. Most theories of personal identity hold that one person cannot be in two places at the same time. Yet in this scenario, there seem to be two physically distinct individuals who are both you. Are future you and present you the same person, numerically identical, or two different people? Epistemic asymmetry. Future you knows everything present. You knows, plus additional facts about what present you will experience. This creates an unusual asymmetry where one person has complete knowledge of another's past, while the other has no knowledge of the first's future. Causal loops. If future you gives present you information or objects that present you wouldn't otherwise have had, this creates a causal loop where the information or object has no clear origin. Present you eventually becomes future you and travels back to give the information to your younger self, who becomes you who travels back, and so on in a loop. Agency and advice. If future you advises present you to make different choices than future you made, this creates a strange situation. Either present you follows the advice, in which case future use memories of not following it become false, or present you ignores the advice, in which case you're ignoring advice from the one person who knows exactly what consequences your choices will have. These puzzles arise partly because our ordinary concept of personal identity presupposes a linear temporal sequence. We think of a person's life as a continuous trajectory through time, with each moment building on previous moments in a unidirectional causal chain. Time travel disrupts this picture, creating situations where the normal relations between temporal parts of a person's life are scrambled. Different theories of personal identity respond differently to these puzzles. Psychological continuity theories, which define personal identity in terms of connected psychological states, memories, beliefs, desires, etc., might suggest that future you and present you are indeed the same person despite being physically distinct, because they share a continuous psychological connection. Bodily continuity theories, which define personal identity in terms of bodily continuity, might suggest that future you and present you are different people, despite their psychological connections, because they are physically distinct bodies. Four-dimensionalist theories, which view persons as extended objects in spacetime with temporal parts like a spacetime worm, might suggest that future you and present you are different temporal parts of the same four-dimensional person, just as your hand and foot are different spatial parts of the same three-dimensional body. Time travel scenarios also raise questions about the direction of causation in personal identity. Normally, our later selves are causally downstream from our earlier selves. Who we become depends on who we were and what we did earlier. But time travel creates situations where our earlier selves might be causally influenced by our later selves, creating circular patterns that challenge linear conceptions of identity formation. As you consider these thought experiments, reflect on what they reveal about your own understanding of personal identity. What makes you the same person as your past self? If you could meet your future self, would you regard them as truly you? Or as someone else who happens to share your memories and characteristics? How would you navigate the epistemic and practical complexities of interacting with a temporal counterpart? These puzzles remind us that our concepts of selfhood and identity through time involve assumptions about temporal linearity that might not hold in all conceivable scenarios. They invite us to develop more nuanced understandings of what constitutes a person and how personal identity persists through temporal complexity, fatalism, and future contingents. Let's now explore a cluster of philosophical puzzles about the future, knowledge, and freedom. The problem of future contingents and the threat of fatalism. The problem of future contingents emerged in ancient Greek philosophy, particularly in Aristotle's discussion of the sea battle. Aristotle considered statements about future contingent events that might or might not happen depending on choices and circumstances. For example, there will be a sea battle tomorrow. Such statements present a puzzle. It seems that any meaningful statement must be either true or false. If there will be a sea battle tomorrow is true today, then the sea battle is already determined to occur. It must happen. If the statement is false today, then the sea battle is already determined not to occur. It cannot happen. Either way, the future event seems predetermined, not contingent. This reasoning leads to fatalism, the view that whatever will happen is already fixed and unavoidable. If true statements about the future already exist, then the events they describe seem destined to occur regardless of our choices or actions. Philosophers have responded to this puzzle in several ways. Aristotle himself suggested that statements about future contingents are neither true nor false until the events they describe either occur or don't occur. This view challenges the principle of bivalence, that every meaningful statement is either true or false, but preserves contingency and freedom. Other philosophers maintain bivalence but deny that truth about the future implies necessity. The statement, "There will be a sea battle tomorrow," might be true today without this making the sea battle necessary or inevitable. Its truth depends on what will happen, not vice versa. Some thinkers distinguish between different kinds of necessity. A future event might be necessary, in the sense that it will definitely occur, without being necessary in the sense that it couldn't have been otherwise. This distinction allows for both definite truth about the future and genuine contingency. Religious traditions have wrestled with related puzzles about divine foreknowledge and human freedom. If God knows everything that will happen, including our future choices, does this make those choices predetermined rather than free? Theologians and philosophers have developed sophisticated responses to this dilemma, distinguishing between God's knowing what we will freely choose and God's causing or necessitating those choices. The problem of future contingence connects to broader questions about time, knowledge, and freedom. It challenges us to clarify the relationship between truth and necessity, the nature of possibility and contingency, and the compatibility of foreknowledge with genuine choice. Modern physics adds another dimension to these puzzles. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest fundamental indeterminism in physical processes, while relativity theory suggests a block universe where all times exist equally. These scientific perspectives offer new frameworks for thinking about future contingency and determinism. As you reflect on these puzzles, consider your own intuitions about the future. Do you think there are definite, determinate facts about what will happen tomorrow, even regarding events that seem to depend on choices you haven't yet made? If so, does this threaten your sense of freedom or open possibility? Or can definite futurity coexist with genuine contingency and choice? The ancient puzzles of future contingence and fatalism remind us that concepts we often take for granted, like future possibility, freedom of choice, and the openness of time, harbor deep philosophical complexities when examined carefully. Purpose and meaning. The meaning of life. Having explored various paradoxes of time, let's turn to perhaps the most profound philosophical question of all. What is the meaning of life? This question can be understood in several ways. What is the purpose of human existence? What makes life valuable or worth living? How can individual lives achieve significance or meaning? Each interpretation leads us in slightly different philosophical directions. Traditional religious approaches often locate life's meaning in relation to God or a transcendent reality. On these views, human lives find purpose in fulfilling divine plans, embodying sacred values, or achieving spiritual states like salvation or enlightenment. Life's meaning comes from beyond human experience, grounded in a cosmic order that gives significance to our finite existence. Secular philosophers have developed various alternative approaches. Objective naturalist views suggest that meaning can be found in pursuing objectively valuable goods like knowledge, moral virtue, aesthetic beauty, or loving relationships even without reference to God or transcendent reality. On these views, certain activities and states of being have intrinsic value that makes pursuing them worthwhile. Subjectivist views locate meaning in subjective attitudes like desire, satisfaction, emotional engagement, or personal fulfillment. On these accounts, what makes your life meaningful is that you find it fulfilling, or that it satisfies your deepest desires, not that it realizes some objective value beyond your own perspective. Hybrid views combine subjective and objective elements, suggesting that meaning emerges when subjective attitudes are directed toward objectively valuable pursuits. On these accounts, meaning requires both that you care deeply about your activities and that these activities connect to goods that have value beyond your subjective experience. Nihilistic views deny that life has any inherent meaning or purpose. Some nihilists conclude that life is therefore absurd or not worth living, while others, like Nietzsche, suggest that the absence of inherent meaning allows us to create our own values and purpose a position sometimes called existentialism. Several recurring themes emerge across these diverse approaches. Meaning often involves transcending narrow self-interest through connection to something larger than oneself. whether that's God, moral ideals, other people, or future generations. It typically includes an integration of present moment satisfaction with longer-term values and goals. And it usually requires some form of narrative coherencia, sense that one's life tells a meaningful story rather than being merely a series of disconnected experiences. The question of life's meaning connects to practical concerns about how to live. Should we seek meaning primarily through achievement and creative work, through loving relationships, through spiritual practice, or through service to others? Does a meaningful life require struggle and sacrifice, or can it consist mainly in happiness and contentment? How should we balance personal fulfillment against broader social commitments? Different philosophical traditions offer varied perspectives. Ancient Greek eudaimonistic approaches focus on living well through the cultivation of virtue and practical wisdom. Buddhist traditions emphasize liberation from suffering through non-attachment and compassion. Existentialist thinkers stress authentic choice and the creation of meaning through committed action in an otherwise meaningless world. As you reflect on the meaning of life, consider your own sources of meaning and purpose. What activities, relationships, or values give your life significance? Do you locate meaning primarily in subjective fulfillment, objective values, or some combination? How do you navigate tensions between personal meaning and broader social or cosmic significance? This perennial question reminds us that philosophy isn't just an abstract intellectual exercise, but a practical pursuit concerned with how we should live and what makes our brief existence valuable and worthwhile. The absurd. Connected to questions about life's meaning is the philosophical concept of the absurd, the apparent contradiction between our human desire for meaning and purpose in a universe that seems to offer none. This concept was most powerfully articulated by existentialist philosophers, particularly Albert Camus. In his essay The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus compares human existence to the fate of the mythological figure Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a mountain only to watch it roll back down, and to repeat this meaningless task for eternity. For Camus, the absurd arises from the confrontation between our human need for meaning and the unreasonable silence of the world. We seek purpose, significance, and rational understanding, but the universe offers no inherent meaning, no cosmic plan, no ultimate answers. This creates a fundamental tension at the heart of human existence. Camus explores three possible responses to the absurd. Suicide. Rejecting life altogether by ending it a response. Camus ultimately rejects as surrendering to the absurd rather than confronting it. Philosophical suicide. Leaping into faith, religion, or abstract philosophical systems that claim to resolve the tension by offering manufactured meaning a response Camus sees as intellectual dishonesty. Acceptance and revolt. Embracing the absurd condition while continuing to seek meaning without the illusion that this tension will ever be resolved, living with lucidity in the face of the absurd. Camus ultimately advocates the third response, suggesting that we can find a kind of dignity and even happiness in clear-eyed confrontation with the absurd. Like Sisyphus, we can embrace our fate with full awareness, finding meaning in the very act of pushing the boulder up the mountain despite knowing it will roll back down. As Camus famously concludes, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Other existentialist thinkers approach the absurd differently. Søren Kierkegaard saw the absurd as a paradox to be embraced through a leap of faith rather than resolved through reason. Jean-Paul Sartre focused on how human freedom and choice create meaning. In an otherwise meaningless universe, we are condemned to be free, and must create our own essence through our choices and commitments. The concept of the absurd connects to broader philosophical questions about nihilism, value, and the limits of human reason. It challenges us to consider whether meaning requires some cosmic grounding, or whether it can emerge from our own choices and commitments, despite the universe's indifference. Modern science has both intensified and complicated the sense of absurdity. Evolutionary biology suggests that our cognitive faculties, including our desire for meaning, evolved for survival value, not for grasping cosmic truths. Cosmology reveals a vast universe, indifferent to human concerns, where our entire species occupies a tiny speck of space for a brief moment of cosmic time. Yet science itself represents a kind of response to the absurd and ongoing effort to understand and find patterns in an often mysterious universe. This suggests that the human quest for meaning and understanding persists even in frameworks that might seem to undermine it. As you reflect on the absurd, consider your own confrontation with these tensions. Have you experienced moments of absurdity when the gap between your desire for meaning and the world's apparent indifference became particularly acute? How did you respond to such moments? Do you find Camus' ideal of clear-eyed acceptance compelling? Or do you see other viable responses to the absurd condition? The concept of the absurd reminds us that philosophical questions about meaning aren't merely abstract puzzles, but lived tensions that we each navigate in our own way. Is beauty objective? From questions of meaning and purpose, let's turn to another domain where subjective experience meets potential objectivity, aesthetic value. Is beauty objective, existing independently of our perceptions, or is it merely subjective, existing only in the eye of the beholder? This question has divided philosophers since ancient times. Plato suggested that beauty has an objective reality. It's a form or idea that beautiful things participate in or imitate. For Plato, when we recognize beauty in particular objects, we're glimpsing something that transcends those objects, a perfect beauty that exists beyond the material world. Other philosophers have defended objective accounts of beauty on different grounds. Aristotle connected beauty to proportion, order, and symmetry properties that could be measured and analyzed. Kant argued that while aesthetic judgments are subjective in one sense, based on feelings of pleasure, they also have a kind of universality. When we judge something beautiful, we implicitly claim that others should agree, suggesting that beauty isn't merely personal preference. More recent objective theories connect beauty to evolutionary psychology, suggesting that our sense of beauty reflects adaptive preferences shaped by natural selection. On this view, we find certain landscapes, faces, or body types beautiful because they signaled health, fertility, or safe environments to our ancestors. On the other side, subjectivist theories argue that beauty exists only in the relationship between objects and observers, not in the objects themselves. The 18th century philosopher David Hume famously wrote, "Beauty is no quality in things themselves. It exists merely in the mind which contemplates them, and each mind perceives a different beauty." Subjectivists point to the wide variation in aesthetic tastes across cultures and individuals. What's considered beautiful in one culture may be considered ugly or unremarkable in another. Even within cultures, aesthetic preferences vary widely between individuals and change over time. These variations suggest that beauty might not be an objective property like mass or chemical composition. Some contemporary philosophers seek middle paths between pure objectivism and pure subjectivism. Intersubjective theories locate beauty not in objects alone or in individual subjective responses, but in shared frameworks of appreciation developed within communities and traditions. Response-dependent theories suggest that beauty is like color. It depends on both objective properties of things and on how those properties affect properly situated observers. Beauty isn't purely in the object, or purely in the eye of the beholder, but emerges from their interaction. The question of beauty's objectivity connects to broader philosophical issues about value, perception, and the relationship between mind and world. It challenges us to consider whether any value aesthetic, moral, or otherwise have reality beyond human responses and cultural practices. This question also has practical implications for art criticism, education, and cultural policy. If beauty is purely subjective, aesthetic education might focus simply on exposing students to diverse styles without judgment. If beauty has objective elements, we might justifiably aim to develop particular kinds of aesthetic sensitivity and discrimination. As you reflect on this question, consider your own experiences with beauty. Do you find yourself disagreeing with others about what's beautiful in ways that seem irresolvable? Or do you find that you can sometimes be persuaded to see beauty you initially missed, suggesting that aesthetic appreciation involves more than just personal preference? Are there qualities you consistently recognize as beautiful across different domains, art, nature, human behavior, suggesting some unity to the concept of beauty? The question of beauty's objectivity reminds us that our most powerful and moving experiences are encounters with the sublime in art or nature raise profound philosophical questions about the relationship between our subjective states and the world beyond ourselves. Why is there something rather than nothing? Let's turn now to what philosopher Robert Nozick called the most profound and disturbing question in philosophy. Why is there something rather than nothing? This question asks not just why this particular universe exists, or why it has the properties it does, but why anything at all exists rather than absolute nothingness. Unlike scientific questions that ask about causes within the existing universe, this metaphysical question asks about the existence of the universe itself. The question's power comes partly from the apparent possibility of nothingness. It seems conceivable that nothing could have existed, no space, time, matter, energy, minds, or laws. Given this apparent possibility, why does something indeed, an extraordinarily rich and complex something, exist instead? Philosophers have offered several approaches to this question. Theological answers suggest that God, or some necessary supernatural being, exists independently and creates everything else. This shifts the question to why God exists rather than nothing, which theists typically answer by arguing that God's existence is necessary rather than contingent. God couldn't not exist. Metaphysical answers suggest that existence itself is necessary rather than contingent. On this view, associated with philosophers like Spinoza and Parmenides, the apparent possibility of absolute nothingness is an illusion. The question assumes that nothing is somehow the default or natural state, when in fact existence may be metaphysically necessary. Probabilistic approaches suggest that if all possibilities are somehow realized, a view sometimes called modal realism, then the existence of something rather than nothing is inevitable. Alone of the possibilities is that something exists, and that possibility is realized. Some multiverse theories in cosmology suggest similar conclusions. Semantic critiques question whether the question itself is meaningful or coherent. Some philosophers argue that nothing isn't a possible state of affairs, but merely a grammatical device, making the question itself confused. Others suggest that the concept of causation breaks down when we try to apply it to existence as a whole. Scientific approaches attempt to explain the universe's existence through physics and cosmology. While science can potentially explain why our particular universe has the properties it does, many philosophers argue that it cannot in principle explain why there are any physical laws or entities at all rather than nothing. This question connects to broader philosophical issues about necessity and contingency, existence and essence, and the limits of explanation. It raises the possibility that some facts, like the fact that something exists, might not have explanations, or might have explanations that transcend our understanding. The question also has existential dimensions. If the existence of the universe and thus our own existence is radically contingent, a kind of cosmic accident, does this affect how we should understand our lives? If existence itself is somehow necessary, does this give our lives a different kind of significance? As you reflect on this question, consider how far back you think explanations can go. Does every fact need an explanation in terms of something else? Or are there some facts that simply have no explanation, or are self-explaining? How satisfying do you find the various approaches to this question, and what does your response reveal about your understanding of existence, explanation, and possibility? This ultimate metaphysical question reminds us of both the power and the limits of human reason. We can pose questions that push beyond all empirical investigation to the very nature of existence itself, yet these questions may exceed our capacity for definitive answers. The mystery of existence remains both the start and the limit of philosophical inquiry. The ultimate nature of reality. As we near the conclusion of our philosophical journey, let's grapple with a question that in some ways encompasses all others. What is the ultimate nature of reality? This question asks about the fundamental character of existence and not just what exists within reality, but what kind of thing reality ultimately is. Different philosophical traditions have offered strikingly different answers. Materialism, or physicalism, holds that physical matter and energy are the fundamental reality. On this view, associated with many scientific naturalists, everything that exists, including minds, consciousness, and values either, is physical or depends on physical processes. The universe consists fundamentally of the particles, fields, and forces described by physics. Idealism maintains that mind or consciousness is the fundamental reality. On this view, associated with philosophers like Berkeley and Hegel, the physical world is in some sense mental, either existing within a divine mind, consisting of ideas or perceptions, or manifesting some absolute consciousness or spirit. Matter derives from mind rather than vice versa. Dualism posits two fundamentally different kinds of reality, mind and matter, or the mental and physical. On this view, associated with Descartes and others, neither the mental nor the physical can be reduced to or explained in terms of the other. Reality consists of two distinct but interacting domains. Neutral monism suggests that reality consists of a single kind of stuff that is itself neither mental nor physical, but can give rise to both mental and physical properties. This view, associated with philosophers like Spinoza and William James, seeks to overcome the mind-body problem by positing a neutral substance underlying both. Panpsychism holds that consciousness or experience is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of reality. On this view, even elementary particles or fundamental fields possess some form of extremely simple consciousness or proto-consciousness. Complex consciousness, like human experience, emerges from the integration of these simpler forms. Each of these metaphysical positions attempts to resolve puzzles about the relationship between mind and matter, subjective experience and objective reality, values and facts. Each has strengths and challenges in accounting for different aspects of our experience and scientific understanding. Beyond these Western philosophical categories, other traditions offer different frameworks for understanding ultimate reality. Buddhist philosophy develops sophisticated analyses of emptiness, shunyata, and dependent origination, the view that all phenomena lack independent existence and arise interdependently. This challenges both materialist and idealist frameworks by questioning the substantiality of both matter and mind. Taoist tradition emphasizes the Tao, or Huayan, ineffable principle underlying and unifying all existence, beyond conceptual distinctions like mind and matter. The Tao operates without intention, yet gives rise to all things through natural unfolding. Advaita Vedanta in Hindu philosophy identifies ultimate reality with Brahman pure consciousness or awareness that is the underlying substance of all existence. Individual consciousness, Atman, is ultimately identical with this universal consciousness. The question of reality's ultimate nature reminds us that even our most basic categories for understanding existence, like the distinction between mind and matter, may be provisional frameworks rather than final truths. It challenges us to consider whether reality might be radically different from how it appears to us, given the limitations of our perceptual and cognitive systems. As you reflect on this question, consider what aspects of reality seem most fundamental to you. Do you find yourself drawn to explanations that start with the physical, the mental, or something beyond both?